Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a nuestra tradicional jornada del Comité Español del Consejo Mundial de la Energía. Este año tiene como título Green Industrial Policies in a Fragmented World y forma parte, un año más, de nuestra serie Energy and Climate Futures que venimos celebrando en este auditorio desde 2017. Mi nombre es Ana Padilla, soy la secretaria general del comité y es un verdadero honor actuar como hilo conductor de este evento hoy. Es un evento solo presencial. Muchas gracias a todos por haber venido hasta aquí en este día frío. Como todos los eventos del comité y del club lo grabaremos, lo pondremos disponible en el canal de YouTube. Tenemos previsto una duración de 3 horas y todas las sesiones, excepto la inaugural, van a ser en inglés. Si requeréis de aparato traductor, pues como hay traducción simultánea lo podéis pedir. Y nada más por mi parte, el hashtag para las redes sociales es #CECME23 y sin más dilación me gustaría dar comienzo a la sesión inaugural invitando a Martin Wetzeler, CEO de esta casa de Cepsa, a tomar la palabra. Gracias.
Muchas gracias y buenos días. Es un honor para mí daros la bienvenida un año más desde la Torre Cepsa a este encuentro que cada año promueve el Comité Español del World Energy Council y ENERCLUB junto a la inestimable colaboración del Real Instituto Elcano. Muchas gracias a todos los organizadores y, por supuesto, a todos los asistentes que nos encontramos hoy aquí para hablar de un tema que nos interesa, nos preocupa y que en estos meses ha cobrado una especial importancia: el papel de las políticas industriales y la transición energética en un contexto mundial de fragmentación. Nos encontramos en un escenario mundial complejo, en el que enfrentamos diversas incertidumbres geopolíticas y energéticas. Y dar respuestas a estos retos resulta más fundamental que nunca para lograr una autonomía estratégica abierta en Europa. En este contexto, las relaciones de la Unión Europea con otras fuerzas mundiales serán un factor determinante. La crisis energética provocada por la invasión rusa de Ucrania ha puesto de manifiesto todas las ventajas y oportunidades de las energías limpias para la seguridad y la independencia energética de nuestro continente. Como señala el escenario de cero emisiones netas de la Agencia Internacional de la Energía, lograr las cero emisiones netas del sector energético para 2050 pasa por triplicar el despliegue de energías renovables ya en esta década. Y se requerirá que el 90% de la inversión total en energía que se haga hasta 2030 sea energía limpia. Estamos consiguiendo grandes resultados, pero tenemos que seguir avanzando. Este año, por ejemplo, la inversión mundial en energía alcanzará los 2,8 billones de dólares, pero aún solo el 61% será de energía limpia, en vez de los 90% que necesitamos. Es evidente que necesitaremos más inversión en el sector, pero la realidad es que se está produciendo un difícil dilema a la hora de decidir sobre la asignación de la capital a inversiones en energías limpias. Por un lado, accionistas se requieren retornos seguros y, por otro lado, inversores en ESG que no invertirán en empresas que no aseguren un determinado porcentaje de CAPEX, digamos un 50%, destinado a energía limpia. Ahora, convertir a Europa en el primer continente del mundo en alcanzar la neutralidad climática es un compromiso vinculante formalizado en el Pacto Verde Europa y las distintas leyes climáticas. El Fit for 55, para que todos los sectores estuviéramos en condiciones de afrontar este reto, empezando por reducir las emisiones al menos 55% para finales de esta década. Esta ambición compartida entre la Administración y las compañías han colocado de la UE en el camino correcto para alcanzar sus objetivos climáticos de manera justa y equilibrada. Y el reto está en acometer esta transición fomentando el crecimiento económico y el bienestar social en un entorno global en la que la cooperación se ha debilitado. Este próximo COP28, que empezará en menos de un mes, va a ser trascendental en ese sentido. No solo porque se hará un primer balance mundial para evaluar el progreso realizado sobre el Acuerdo de París, sino por la necesidad de alcanzar nuestros nuevos objetivos y acuerdos y ser capaces de establecer medidas correctoras que aceleran aún más la transición energética. Las industrias y las empresas tenemos un papel protagonista en este contexto. La descarbonización del sector industrial es en efecto clave para la transición energética. Vectores energéticos como el hidrógeno verde son una solución que nos permitirá descarbonizar actividades donde la electrificación no es viable. Y en este marco de papel activo, por parte del sector privado, debemos situar en el centro un espíritu de alianzas y colaboración. La experiencia nos ha demostrado que la transición no puede abordarse ni por capacidad ni por volumen de recursos únicamente desde el sector público o desde el privado. Cada parte tiene una función fundamental que cumplir y desde nuestros propósitos particulares debemos apoyarnos, porque avanzamos hacia un objetivo común. Desde Cepsa tenemos claro que nuestro papel es el de seguir contribuyendo activamente a la transición energética en España y en Europa. Y queremos seguir haciéndolo a través de colaboraciones y alianzas. Estoy seguro de que esta jornada de hoy permitirá profundizar estos debates y extraer conclusiones esenciales para tratar de dar respuesta a los retos que nos plantea un entorno mundial tan complejo como plagado de oportunidades que debemos aprovechar todos. Muchas gracias a todos. Y ahora tengo el placer de ceder la palabra a Ana Paula Márquez, presidenta del Comité Español del World Energy Council. Ana Paula.
Entonces, buenos días a todos. Consejero delegado de Cepsa, dear Martin, presidente del Real Instituto Elcano, José Juan Ruiz, a nuestro presidente del Club Español de Energía, Mario Ruiz Talle. Queridos amigos, es un placer para mí participar en esta nueva edición de nuestra jornada anual. Me gustaría comenzar dirigiendo unas palabras de agradecimiento a ENERCLUB, al Real Instituto Elcano, a todos y cada uno de los miembros del comité por su apoyo en la organización de este evento y también a Cepsa, en particular a Martín, por el patrocinio y acogernos una vez más en su casa, y a todos los moderadores y ponentes que conforman el programa, especialmente los que han viajado de lejos y a todos vosotros que nos acompañan en este magnífico auditorio. El evento de hoy es especial porque para nosotros es un evento que en relación al Consejo Mundial de Energía y a sus comités nacionales es muy relevante. Esta ocasión es especial, además, porque coincide con el 100º aniversario del WEC. En este siglo de historia, la labor del Consejo ha sido fundamental por su capacidad de establecer diálogos a nivel global, por su capacidad de encontrar espacios de colaboración en temas de interés común y por su diversidad en todos los sentidos, geográfica, fuentes energéticas, tecnologías, stakeholders y muchos otros. El WEC nos brinda la oportunidad de mirar más allá de nuestras fronteras, de comprender realidades de distintos países como éstas navegan en sus transiciones energéticas. En un mundo muy fragmentado, como cita el título de nuestro encuentro, esta capacidad de diálogo, de colaboración, de amplitud de miras, esta diversidad, son herramientas verdaderamente valiosas para atajar a los grandes retos con que nos enfrentamos como sociedad y también para alcanzar el fin último, que debe ser lo mismo para todos: lograr un futuro mejor para las personas y para nuestro planeta. Hoy más que nunca, la energía no solo forma parte de la agenda, sino que ocupa un lugar propio en la conversación. Hay un cambio de paradigma que puede suponer la actual transición energética en un mundo que estamos aquí también, en que la energía tiene un papel de protagonista en esa búsqueda de un futuro mejor. Cuando comenzamos a preparar este evento, buscamos temáticas que se pueden abordar aprovechando esta perspectiva más amplia que mezcle distintas disciplinas, que busque además un carácter diferenciador al respecto de otros actos del club. Tratamos de clarificar cuáles son los temas más candentes de la agenda internacional relacionados con el mundo energético. Para esta edición tuvimos claro desde el principio que el hilo conductor debían ser las políticas industriales verdes lanzadas en estos últimos años, como el Green Deal Industrial Plan de la Comisión Europea o el Inflation Reduction Act y el nuevo panorama generado en torno de ellas. Un panorama que seguro abre incertidumbres relacionadas con los impactos de las industrias en ambos los lados del Atlántico, los objetivos climáticos, la geopolítica o las relaciones internacionales y comerciales que habíamos tratado de materializar en el programa de nuestro evento. Sabemos la relevancia que las políticas industriales pasan por la necesidad urgente de descarbonizar nuestras economías para luchar contra el cambio climático, que la transición energética tiene que ser justa, que va de la mano de la industrialización y de la creación de empleo. Por la importancia, además, que las tecnologías limpias sean, en la medida de lo posible, homemade, minimizando los riesgos de la seguridad de suministro, pero manteniendo esta vinculación con el resto de las economías que seguirán siendo tan necesarias. Y de nuevo, la colaboración entre todos y a todos los niveles es muy necesaria. Es clave, además, la colaboración de los sector privado, los reguladores, para garantizar los incentivos adecuados, procesos claros de aprobación de inversiones, tajas de retorno competitivas en las inversiones. Una regulación y una legislación estable y predictible es imprescindible. Asimismo, es esencial la colaboración público-privada y también entre el sector energético y con otras industrias como la manufacturera para acelerar la descarbonización, reducir costes y hacerlas más competitivas, más aún en un contexto de incertidumbre de carrera industrial ligada a nuevos vectores energéticos. Finalmente, la colaboración entre todos, que lo mencioné, es crucial para lograr poner el ciudadano en el centro de este proceso de transformación que estamos viviendo, para que comprenda la emergencia climática en la que nos encontramos, para que pueda sentir los beneficios de la transición y la importancia vital que juegan las infraestructuras y las industrias. Solo si contamos con beneplácito y participación social podremos alcanzar los objetivos. Nada más por mi parte, solo desear que os sea útil esta jornada, que promete ser muy interesante por el nivel de ponentes que reúne este programa, y también agradecer a Arcadio y a Ana por todo el trabajo también desarrollado en el club. Y a continuación me gustaría ceder la palabra a José Juan Ruiz Gómez, el presidente del Real Instituto Elcano. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias, Martín. Muchas gracias, Ana Paula. Muchas gracias, Mario. Muchas gracias al Club de la Energía por la oportunidad que le da al Real Instituto Elcano de cumplir este rito tan agradable de inaugurar estas jornadas que llevamos haciendo ya 3 años. Para nosotros, en cierta manera, es hacer una descarga de nuestra responsabilidad, que no es otra que traer al debate de la sociedad española, de las empresas, del Gobierno, de la oposición, los temas de la conversación global que nos importan y hacer análisis basados en el rigor, la independencia y los datos. Y probablemente es muy difícil encontrar algo que sea tan importante en la conversación global como el título de la conferencia que hoy nos convoca aquí. Ese trilema, trilogía de políticas industriales, política climática y mundo fragmentado, es una síntesis perfecta, como ya han anunciado las intervenciones de mis colegas, de los temas que realmente nos preocupan. Hay algo inquietante en las trilogías. Desde la trilogía de la Santísima Trinidad, cuando al cerebro humano se le presentan tres opciones, nuestra tendencia a simplificar la navaja de Ockham nos lleva casi de forma instantánea e inconsciente a elegir dos de los objetivos y dejar el otro de un lado. Y por lo tanto es lícito, si ustedes se acuerdan por qué hago esta referencia, hace 30 años, en el momento clave de la hiperglobalización, Dani Rodrik expuso una teoría muy simple, la que decía que era difícil poder conseguir la democracia, la soberanía y la globalización, las tres cosas a la vez. En los 90 pensamos que lo que iba a caer era la soberanía de las naciones, que la democracia y la globalización eran objetivos ya conseguidos y que solo se podía avanzar. Por eso se escribieron libros como El mundo es llano, ¿no? Hoy, 30 años después, lo que estamos viendo es que lo que parece que está en riesgo es la democracia y la globalización. Y este es algo que nos debería hacer reflexionar cuando nos planteamos estas trilogías, estos trilemas tan ambiciosos. ¿Por qué? ¿Es posible realmente hacer políticas de net zero con políticas industriales en un mundo fragmentado? Si ustedes les preguntan a los economistas, la mayor parte de ellos les van a decir que no, que es muy difícil hacerlas, que hay trade-offs. Hay trade-offs porque el net zero, por encima de cualquier otra cosa, es un bien público global. Y los economistas sabemos desde hace mucho tiempo que el problema de los bienes públicos es cómo se excluye de su consumo o cómo se incluye en su producción a todos los agentes. Y solo hemos descubierto que esto solo se podía hacer a través de impuestos y de subsidios que internalizaran los costes y subsidios que permitiesen llevar a cabo un proceso de corrección de las fallas de mercado. Estamos en un momento en el que nos estamos olvidando de esta parte de la dificultad del bien público global y además pretendemos hacerlo con políticas industriales en un mundo fragmentado. Las políticas industriales tienen justificación en la teoría económica, ha habido casos de éxito, ha habido casos de fracaso que tampoco deberían echarse en el saco roto. Pero el gran problema que hoy tenemos es que el sumatorio de políticas industriales nacionales o de bloques no necesariamente conducen a la política industrial global que necesitamos para alcanzar el net zero. Este es uno de los grandes temas que deberíamos estar prestándole quizá más atención. Lo que nos conduce es a un mundo de second best, a un mundo en el que no necesariamente vamos a estar mejor ni en el objetivo de net zero, ni en el objetivo de soberanía nacional, ni en el objetivo de crecimiento. Hay trade-offs y no reconocer estos trade-offs creo que va a ser una piedra en el camino hacia el objetivo que todos queremos de que las emisiones sean ceros. Alguien va a tener que contar de dónde salen los recursos para pagar los costes de eficiencia que suponen algunas de estas políticas industriales, sobre todo en términos de crecimiento económico. Creo que es muy importante la semántica y muy importante la transparencia. Políticas industriales son muchas cosas. Se pueden hacer buenas políticas industriales siempre que nos preguntemos qué falla del mercado queremos corregir, con qué instrumento la queremos hacer, cómo vamos a evaluar la eficiencia y cómo van a colaborar y vamos a captar la información necesaria para diseñarla de manera eficiente entre el sector público y el sector privado. Pero políticas industriales no pueden ser el sinónimo de un intento de renovación de la soberanía nacional para poder hacer políticas que se escapan de la disciplina del mercado y de la disciplina y de los objetivos que nos estamos imponiendo. Esto creo que es uno de los temas importantísimos que deberíamos estar reflexionando sobre ellos. Si alguno tiene duda de cuánto esto cuesta, vayan al documento que apareció ayer de la Comisión Europea en la que se evalúan los costes del subsidio a la energía en la Unión Europea. 390.000 millones de euros en el año 2022, 170.000 millones de euros más que en el 2021, teniendo por medio, por supuesto, las condiciones muy especiales que hemos tenido. Es importantísimo evitar la hipérbole. Y estamos en un mundo de hipérboles, un mundo en el que la fragmentación del mercado la damos por hecha. No están los datos, ni en los datos de comercio, ni en los datos de inversión directa, ni en los datos de acceso a los mercados de capitales. No están los datos esa fragmentación, pero la podemos conseguir. Si nos empeñamos, conseguiremos fragmentar los mercados y las cadenas de valor. Quizá habría que ser un poco más prudente e intentar pensar en cómo el mundo al que nos dirigimos, para que sea compatible con el net zero, necesita recuperar alguna definición sensata y digerible política y económicamente de equilibrios. Establecer nuevos equilibrios, equilibrios entre la eficiencia, la soberanía y la seguridad de suministro, equilibrios entre el papel del mercado y del Estado, equilibrios entre la capacidad de un país de llevar políticas industriales y la coordinación a nivel global con cesión o no cesión de soberanía. Y por último, creo que sería muy bueno también recuperar la prudencia y el sosiego y considerar la transición energética no solo como lo que sabemos que es, un tema existencial, de riesgo existencial, un tema cultural, un tema político, un tema geopolítico. La transición energética también es un tema y fundamentalmente un tema económico. Para conseguirla hace falta invertir y para invertir se necesita una estructura previsible y anticipable de incentivos de mercado y de políticas de intervención y de calibración de esos incentivos. Mientras esas políticas no estén sobre la mesa, mientras la transición energética no sea un problema que trasciende de la conversación global y aterriza en un problema de inversión y de asunción de costes hundidos de una industria que ha generado el crecimiento de los últimos 300 años, podremos estar dando vueltas en redondo y sin avanzar mucho. Por eso es por la razón por la que desde Elcano pretendemos que la energía, el eje de energía, sea uno de los ejes centrales de nuestra actividad. Creemos que esto, junto con la defensa de la democracia, la defensa y el porvenir de Europa, es de los grandes temas que nos afectarán y seguirán afectando nuestro desarrollo. Y por eso estamos tan contentos de poder estar aquí y un año más contribuir con nuestros panelistas, con nuestras ideas, a que esto sea un éxito y a que la reflexión sea mucho más serena, con menos relato y con más datos. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días a todos, buenos días a Martín, buenos días a Ana Paula Márquez, muchas gracias por la invitación, y también a José Juan Ruiz por sus reflexiones, preocupaciones y provocaciones, que son tan importantes en este momento. Como decía, es un placer para nosotros, como Club Español de Energía, poder participar un año más en la apertura de este evento anual del Comité Español Mundial de la Energía. Y tener la oportunidad de pronunciar también unas palabras en vuestra excelente compañía. Creo que estamos en un momento francamente importante de la transición energética. Como bien decía Martín, tenemos una COP a 30 días vista y sobre ella tenemos que trabajar todos juntos para poder conseguir colocar los temas que vemos como más relevantes. El año pasado, en este mismo encuentro, hablábamos, entre otros temas, de las consecuencias a nivel europeo que había tenido la crisis energética desencadenada por la guerra de Ucrania. Y hablábamos de que había tenido, pero que hoy día, desgraciadamente, tenemos que seguir sosteniendo que continúan presentes. Durante este tiempo, Europa, tras comprobar sus vulnerabilidades y ver sus urgentes necesidades que tenía la amplia dependencia energética, se ha visto obligada a hacer una reflexión bastante profunda sobre cuáles son los temas que le afectan a su seguridad energética y cuáles son las implicancias que esta seguridad tiene en su mundo industrial. Más concretamente sobre la dependencia y la competitividad que están estrechamente ligadas con la volatilidad de los combustibles fósiles, también en relación a sus precios o incluso viviendo las circunstancias de sufrir su indisponibilidad. En un tiempo récord, creo que Europa ha sido capaz de empezar a ser más independiente. Sabemos que este esfuerzo no ha sido fácil ni ha sido barato. Ha sido un esfuerzo en el cual queda aún mucho por hacer y que en materia de energía también, por ejemplo, necesitamos avanzar en cadenas de suministro, en materiales críticos y en minerales. Al mismo tiempo, la crisis nos ha llevado a que en Europa y sus Estados miembros presten aún mucho más atención al proceso de descarbonización de la economía y a los objetivos de net cero. Y también hemos aprendido que la importancia de apoyar a la industria europea es un proceso fundamental. Y para ello se han lanzado con urgencia y con agilidad paquetes de medidas que todos conocemos: la Ley de Industria de Cero Emisiones Netas, la Ley Europea de Materias Primas Fundamentales, así como también respuestas de Europa a leyes que se han dictado en otros países o continentes, como por ejemplo Estados Unidos, China o Japón, que ya habían puesto en marcha respuesta a políticas o medidas industriales. Se ha iniciado entonces claramente una carrera por la industrialización verde. En este contexto geopolítico, como veíamos recién por las palabras de José Juan, cada día más complejo, en donde un nuevo conflicto en Medio Oriente nos preocupa y que de extenderse puede llevar nuevamente a que estas tensiones en los mercados energéticos sigan afectando al avance y a la agilidad de la transición. Tenemos muchas cuestiones encima de la mesa. ¿Cuáles están siendo los efectos de las políticas industriales que estamos poniendo en marcha? ¿Cuáles son las oportunidades de cooperación que tenemos para ejecutar estas políticas? ¿En qué posición se encuentra Europa y en qué posición se quiere encontrar Europa en los próximos años? ¿Cómo hacer que nuestra industria europea sea más competitiva ante este avance de la industrialización verde en el mundo? ¿Qué podemos esperar también de la COP28? Yo creo que son todas cuestiones relevantes y que nos traen materias que vamos a abordar en el evento de hoy. Son cuestiones que, como decía, nuestros expertos abordarán y que, como mencionaba la Paula, desde una perspectiva amplia, van a ser analizados. Pero por mi parte, me gustaría citar muy brevemente 3 puntos. Aunque parezca como un trilema, vamos a arriesgar nuevamente la posibilidad de poder elegir 3 puntos. Y creo que son fundamentales para Europa, pero también para España, y en que se puedan aprovechar realmente las oportunidades que esta transición energética y esta industrialización verde nos puede traer como país. En primer lugar, ya lo señalaba José Juan, creo que es fundamental la necesidad de construir con diálogo, con visión de futuro, los marcos regulatorios que sean estables y con grados de previsibilidad suficiente para que los inversores que van a tener que abordar desde el mundo público y privado estas inversiones de la transición energética puedan tener la estabilidad suficiente para apoyar este proceso. Una cifra fácil de recordar: en España el nuevo PNIEC nos convoca a unas inversiones casi de 300.000 millones de euros, de los cuales se espera que el 85% de estas inversiones sean desarrolladas por el sector privado. Para eso es fundamental que se incluya un marco regulatorio predecible y un marco regulatorio estable, y que faciliten las inversiones también con un desarrollo ordenado y planificado, para no estresar cadenas de suministro y que generen incrementos de costes innecesarios. Creo que es importante también incluir en toda esta industria a las redes de transporte, a las líneas de distribución y el almacenamiento que permitan la mayor penetración de las energías renovables. Creo que es importante también que estos marcos regulatorios resuelvan o aborden definitivamente la agilidad en el proceso de tramitación y permisos de concesiones. Creo que es fundamental, si pensamos en que los plazos que tenemos necesitamos llegar con ellos y con los proyectos suficientemente avanzados para poder cumplir con las metas que nos hemos planteado. El plan, tanto en España, el PNIEC, el Plan Nacional Integrado de Energía y Clima, como los planes europeos del Fit for 55 que apuestan por un sistema eléctrico con elevada penetración renovable, nos dejan cada vez más clara la magnitud del desafío. Yo creo que, en segundo lugar, la importancia de redefinir los sistemas de apoyo existentes. Yo creo que ese gran volumen de subsidios que estamos viendo, tenemos que tener la absoluta certeza y claridad que van a ser bien focalizados para los objetivos que tenemos. Necesitamos sistemas de ayuda más ágiles que permitan acelerar la respuesta y con mayores grados de flexibilidad. La importancia también de introducir mecanismos que permitan que estas reglas sean comunes y justas para toda la sociedad. Yo creo que es fundamental, como decía Ana Paula, la incorporación del ciudadano en el proceso de transición justa para que esto no sea tarea de unos y deberes de otros. Como, por ejemplo, la propuesta de reforma de mercado que se ha hecho este año en el mercado europeo de la energía, en donde vemos un buen camino, ya que se privilegia el mercado, no se establecen medidas de intervención en el mercado con carácter permanentes o estructurales y se reconoce el funcionamiento que el mercado ha tenido, a pesar de las dificultades que ello ha provocado durante los últimos años. Yo creo que el reciente acuerdo alcanzado por el Consejo de Ministros, por la Comisión y por el Parlamento muestra la capacidad de Europa de atender y superar la crisis energética en la que estamos. Y por último, creo que es fundamental también que se realice un análisis de las necesidades y riesgos de cada ecosistema industrial clave que tenemos. En estos momentos estamos viviendo una situación bastante compleja en el mundo de la energía eólica, tanto terrestre como marina, en donde es fundamental preservar la industria europea. Y creo que con ello la creación de planes específicos para este tipo de industrias son fundamentales para alcanzar nuestras metas. Yo creo que el Plan de Acción Europeo sobre la energía eólica va muy bien encaminado en esa línea y muestra una vez más la capacidad de respuesta. Sus medidas sí es necesario que se apliquen lo antes posible para que tengan altos grados de efectividad. Como decía, estamos en un momento tremendamente relevante. Revisaremos en esta COP los avances que tenemos y los desafíos que nos quedan por delante. El objetivo de evitar el incremento de temperatura global de 1,5 grados está a nuestro alcance y es nuestro deber alcanzarlo. Para concluir, creo que por suerte contamos con muchas de las tecnologías que son necesarias y en el caso particular de España tenemos una situación privilegiada, siendo ya un hub energético de referencia en donde tenemos recursos renovables, ubicaciones, terrenos, conocimiento, talento y las infraestructuras necesarias para abordar este desafío. Creo que debemos aprovechar este esfuerzo con diálogo, con unidad, con visión de futuro y, sobre todo, concluyo aquí mis palabras abordando y dejando claramente concluida este gran desafío que tenemos de la transición energética. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Martín, Ana Paula, José Juan y Mario. Damos comienzo ahora rápidamente a la siguiente sesión. Invito a Ana Paula a mantenerse en el escenario porque seguirá en la siguiente sesión y al resto, pues muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, la siguiente sesión va a estar centrada, va a poner el foco en Estados Unidos y tendrá el formato de entrevista, donde tenemos el privilegio de contar con la moderación de nuestra presidenta, como he dicho, Ana Paula Márquez. Me gustaría invitar a subir al escenario a Tom Terbus, presidente de EPRI International, que no habla español, por lo que voy a cambiar a inglés. Mr. Terbus, it's a pleasure having you here in Madrid for our event. Please, when you can take the seat by Ana Paula. We leave you in very good hands with Ana conducting the session. Thank you.
Well, dear Tom, while they microphone you, it's a pleasure having you with us. Many thanks for having accepted our invitation to travel to Madrid for this event. And let me start by introducing you shortly to the audience. Tom Berbush works at the Electric Power Research Institute. He serves as Vice President of Member and Technical Services, and is also the President of Electric Power Research Institute International. He's accountable for the overall funding and collaborative engagement with members and partners, organizations in the United States, and also over 45 other countries in support of EPRI's mission to drive innovation to ensure the public has safe, reliable, affordable, and clean energy around the globe. Since joining EPRI in 1997, Terbush has held a wide range of positions in Europe, Asia, and North America, involving economics, nuclear, power delivery, sales, marketing, and technology transfer. Prior to joining the Institute, you worked with US and Japanese organizations on energy economics, technology, and deregulation. So for us, it's really a pleasure to have you here today. He has also a PhD in economics from George Mason University, where he developed expertise in energy economics and energy regulation, energy markets, and economic performance. So I think we will have a very interesting session, and it's for me a pleasure to be here moderating. So Tom, my first question to you is, would you mind starting by explaining briefly about the mission of the organization you lead, what you do, where you work with around the world, and the relationship you have with the World Energy Council?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to have me here. Obviously, I'm blushing after that introduction because it makes me sound much more important than I probably am. But let me talk about EPRI very quickly. We were founded over 50 years ago in Palo Alto, California, in the United States, with a mission as a nonprofit NGO with a mission to make electricity cleaner, more reliable, safer, more affordable. Over those 50 years, our mission has become much more global, and electricity is refocused into energy. Reliable has kind of morphed into resiliency in addition to reliability. Affordable is morphed into equity, making things more equitable, and clean is really morphed into sustainable and decarbonized. And we work with over 1,000 energy companies, universities, research institutes, member governments, technology providers in more than 50 countries around the world, ultimately to identify the key challenges that the world is facing in energy, short-term and long-term. We crowdsource the concepts for solutions. We crowdsource the funding that's necessary to get them done. We find the best people in the world to do the work, and then we work with all these companies and entities to basically demonstrate and deploy the technologies. And our relationship with the World Energy Council, for many years, we've been working with really the headquarters in London on studies, thought leadership, providing technical information to make sure that gets to everybody. And a couple of years ago, we took over leadership of the US chapter. And as part of that, we're really making a concerted effort to reach out to the other chapters like the Spanish chapter, the Spanish committee, to see how we can support, see how we can share knowledge, to see how we can help what's going on in Spain, and likewise learn from Spain in the United States.
Thank you. Tom, we are in a, it was mentioned in the beginning of the introduction also by Mario, we are in a crucial year for the climate change international negotiations with COP28 taking place a few weeks now in Dubai. Last September in New York, nearly 200 countries met at the United Nations Climate Change Summit to really assess how we were on track to meeting the promise that we made under the Paris Agreement as part of the process that is now called the Global Stockade. This assessment should now guide countries to set new, more ambitious climate policies and funding for clean energy to get closer to the objective that we have of the 1.5 degrees goal. So how do you see the global CO2 challenges from the point of view of the American energy transformation? And what are your key energy and climate goals and the type of difficulties that you are finding to reach them, and how compatible they are with the other dimension of the energy trilemma that was already discussed here today, that it's affordability and security of supply?
Wow, well, okay, that's a lot to answer in 3 minutes or whatever I have, but let's talk about, obviously we all agree that the challenge of this transformation is immense. It almost feels impossible, but we know we have to do it no matter what. You know, obviously carbon emissions have been rising. I think globally we've seen a 40%, 50% increase in the last 30 years. Europe and North America are a little different. We've actually hit inflection points and we're coming down. So if you look at this chart here, it's not unlike Europe. I think Europe is probably doing better than the US, but we hit an inflection point, you know, say 15 years ago where we've seen carbon emissions going down, but they're not nearly fast enough. And if you look at the goal for the United States from the Paris agreements, we're supposed to reduce carbon emissions, CO2, to by 50 or 52% by 2030. Nowhere near on track to do that. We're going to talk a little bit more about the recent legislation and incentives that come from the U.S. government that certainly are getting us closer, but we're not quite there, but we do have a long way to go. Challenge-wise, if you look at, obviously, environmental sustainability is what this is all about, and it's bigger than carbon. But if you look at energy security, we're going from a fuel-rich energy system historically, which had energy security implications, whether it was oil and gas, Russian gas in the case of Europe. The U.S. has become increasingly energy independent, but now we're moving to a system that's mineral-rich. There's all these critical minerals out there that at the current time, maybe there's only 1 or 2 countries that are actually sourcing these materials, processing materials. If we learned anything from the pandemic, it's a supply chain that relies on one country, thousands of miles away from you. It's probably not a sustainable strategy. And while we in Europe and North America and everywhere else in the world are ambitiously trying to get more minerals, get more manufacturing in line so we can put up more renewables, more transmission lines, everything else we have to do, we're all going to be fighting over the same supply chain. So we have to figure out how to expand these supply chains, interlink them, and make that work. So that's going to be critical for energy security. And then really the third leg of the trilemma, which is really affordability and equity. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I mean, it's a deal killer if we don't get that right, because the whole thing could stop.
Tom, I think it's interesting, you've mentioned the US and Europe. It's been now a year since the IRA and also since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. They are providing multi-billion-dollar incentives to decarbonize industry and to develop manufacturing of low-carbon technologies. And some might argue that that was a wake-up call for the EU Green Industrial Policy. Could you explain a bit to us your perspective on the 2 acts, and in particular, what are the initial results that you are seeing regarding its implementation?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we'll start. If you go back to 2021, late 2021, the infrastructure legislation was passed, which really doled out a lot of money for infrastructure. And over $100 billion of that was a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package for the United States. Over $100 billion of that was earmarked for clean energy, for decarbonized technologies, hydrogen, electric vehicles, transmission build out, new technologies. And they had a large cost share to it, but that had an impact, but it paled in comparison to what came next. And there was a CHIPS Act, which we didn't mention, that also that's a $350 billion thing to really onshore semiconductor manufacturing. That had $50 billion of decarbonized component to it as well. But what came immediately after that, the IRA, everything else pales in comparison. So, I mean, this was a very, very large thing. On paper, it only had $359 billion worth of projected incentives. So it was a different approach. IRA and CHIPS were more grants, investment. This one, the Inflation Reduction Act, it was incentives, tax credits to try and incentivize private investment in clean energy. And it's actually, so far, I mean, it's early. It's only a year in, but it's been, the preliminary signs are not only that it's successful beyond our wildest dreams. The uptake in the incentives right now is projected to be triple what we thought it was, which is great if you care about sustainability and clean energy. Not so good if you're trying to balance the government accounts when you thought you were going to spend this and now you're going to spend over 10 years 3 times that. We're sorting that out, but that has really motivated a lot of investment. So these are in all areas of clean energy. So it's clean power production, not just renewables, but also nuclear. It's in clean molecules, it's in hydrogen, carbon capture. It covers electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and clean fuels for flight, for airplanes, things like that. If you look at really the overall impact, we projected $1.2 trillion worth of incentive uptake over 10 years, but the investment that's stimulating, we're projecting about $3 trillion worth of clean energy investment over the next 10 years. And which will go into a lot more. And you see some of these announcements, well over $1 trillion worth of announcements just in the last year and a half. Some of those are semiconductors, but most of that is electric vehicle, clean energy, a lot of renewables, transmission lines, and this is the additional investments being made to take advantage of those tax credits.
Do you believe, Tom, that the IRA is putting the US closer to meeting the Paris Agreement, its Paris Agreement objectives? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I would say that it's definitely making it closer. I mean, if you looked at that chart earlier and the projection, I'm going to go back to this, but if you looked at the chart earlier where the curve, we bent the curve, much like you have in Europe, but the trajectory is not nearly what it needs to be. We need to double, really triple the reductions over the next 10 years. So it has gotten better. You see, if you look at the components of it, whether it's electric vehicles or renewables installations, heat pumps in homes for home heating, IRA has helped a lot. It hasn't quite gone as to where we need to be. I mean, if you look at this chart, if you look at the projections out before the IRA, where your kind of base cases, EPRI does a lot of analysis. We have a lot of economists in one little group that do a lot of like general economic analysis in North America and other regions. And we saw really that the trajectory we're on was not good. Nowhere close to the Paris Agreement. IRA gets us much closer, probably a 40% reduction based off 2005. Still doesn't get us all the way there. We'll see how that plays out. Just to get that 40% reduction is challenging. We're going to need more to get to the 50%. And EPRI doesn't really advocate for policy, so I'm not going to say what that policy is going to need to be, but it's going to need to be more. So.
And do you think it will help the IRA? It will help reinforce US as a key global climate negotiator?
I think in the short term, absolutely. Right, so the U.S. is making major investments in clean energy. I mean, the U.S., historically, it's the largest carbon emitter in the history of the world. So the U.S. needs to take a leadership role in investing and bending this curve. I think in the short term, it gives the U.S. government probably a lot of status to try to be at that table and try to, this is a global challenge. We've got to work together globally. On the long term, obviously, if we don't hit the 50 or 52%, that reduces our ability to be an honest partner in this.
I mentioned in the beginning the importance of collaboration between governments and also between the public and the private sector as being key to really overcome the type of challenges that we'll face ahead. In particular, I really believe that transatlantic alliances will be fundamental, including to de-risking strategies from some other countries that are not in the both sides of the Atlantic. What do you think are the main opportunities for collaboration between the two sides, and in what particular areas do you see this collaboration?
Well, I think we already do a lot of collaboration, but I think there's opportunity to do a lot more. So I would say there's at least two areas. One is just sharing and collaborating together on technology development, sharing best practice, regulatory approaches. I mean, our regulators are overwhelmed with all these things that they have to do immediately, and how are they going to do it? And Europe is doing that. In the US, we have 50 different sets of regulators for 50 different states. They all need to learn from each other. Europe needs to learn from the US. We need to learn from Europe. And then we need to share that knowledge, share our people, share our learning, share the technology development. I think the second thing is sort of related, which we need to, I think, integrate our supply chains more than ever. We're already fairly integrated, but we need to really think through. We've got all this money, all these incentives to transform our energy economies over the next 7 to 10 years. So the money's going to be there. There's going to be a lot going on. If we don't figure out how to reduce whatever barriers are, real or perceived, in working together, it's going to make it that much tougher.
You mentioned the barriers that you are seeing. What do you believe that we are not doing enough to really overcome those barriers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a trade expert, so I'm not going to delve too far into that. But I would say, obviously at the beginning, the Inflation Reduction Act had some Made in America provisions, which were probably counterproductive for integrating our supply chains. So that sort of thinking is neat. And obviously, the U.S. administration is walking that back a lot. They need to keep walking it back. But we need to make sure we avoid those sorts of missteps and figure out how to work together.
We normally talk about climate change, security, and other challenges at institutional, political, technology, and regulatory levels. And maybe we are not putting enough attention in the people dimension, which is also key in this energy transition. And we talked about this yesterday at dinner, like all the challenges that we are facing. How do you see also, not only in EPRI, but also in WEC, these social aspects? What particular actions do you believe that could be implemented that have the necessary impact in the society that we need to bring along with us?
Yeah, no, that's important. I would say there's at least three things. One, education. And we need to work together on educating not just energy consumers, but really the workforce, the leaders, the experts of the future. We need more experts and more leaders than we have today to envision the system for the future. So really it's education, bringing people along. I think the second thing is we need to turn, in English we would say, turn consumers into prosumers. We need to make sure that end users, energy consumers, aren't just passive. They're actually they're contributing to the solutions that we face today. If you look at, certainly I'm more familiar with the US, but we also see this in other places where we have outages or near misses on capacity margin, where the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing and load's going up for some reason and we've got a 2 megawatt shortfall and everyone's freaking out trying to solve that problem. We've relied on different tools, rolling brownouts, industry doing demand response. We need to really provide the tools and the programs and incentives so that every person can use their building as a resource for the grid. So we ultimately have grid flexibility. It's going to save us a lot of money. We'll have to build a lot less supply if we can rely on end users to provide part of the solution. That will save us trillions of dollars globally. And then I'd say lastly, it's about affordability and equity. I mean, we cannot afford to leave anybody behind. If we don't figure out how to make, we've done some studies in the US where we show that we can make the transition affordable, even with horrible prices on supply chain, extraction of minerals, all this. We can do it if you look at the full energy wallet. If you look at what a person spends or a household spends on energy between electricity, natural gas, fuel for their vehicle, and all these other expenses, we can probably make it affordable, but not if we do silly things on incentives and taxation versus electricity rates. So we got to think through how to make the change acceptable from a pocketbook perspective. I mean, I don't know about Europe, but certainly in the United States, if the energy transition proves expensive, it could kill the energy transition. It could set us back decades, and we just can't afford that. And, just stepping back, and we all have a stake in this. I mean, I think we all know the challenge is immense. We're probably all, if we're really thinking it through, we're very afraid of what we have to do over the next 7 years and questioning whether it's possible. But we know, and deep down in our bones, I think if you're here, we can do this. Society has done crazier things in the past. We can come together and make this transition happen, make it affordable, but not if we don't do it together. And that's not just Europe and North America. That's every person in this room, every consumer, every company. We got to make sure we work together. So I challenge all of us to just let's work together, let's find new opportunities, let's educate, let's get out there.
Tom, just one final question for you. You've mentioned that it's a collective responsibility. You see both sides of the Atlantic, not just where you are located, but also all the collaboration you have with the different countries and the different chapters that you work with. You have here present both presential and also in remote, many people from the sector, from the private, from the public sector. What do you believe is a final message that you would like to convey to the sector as a whole and to all the people interacting in the ecosystem regarding the challenges that we face ahead?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, we do have to work together. We can do this. We have to help each other. It's not regulators versus private companies versus member governments. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're a regulator, that's the worst job in the world right now, to try to figure out how to integrate all this. It's thankless. And so we have to, if you're not a regulator, if you're a private company, energy company, we have to figure out how to help the regulators do their job, how to help do our jobs, how to work together. Because we can't end up pointing fingers at each other. We have to actually just reach across, assume that the person across the aisle from you wants to work with you, and do that. And that goes whether it's an ocean or a political aisle or a regulatory private construct. And we know it's crazy, but we have to be talking to one another. We have to be aligning our goals and just doing it.
So thank you very much, Tom. It was very interesting, everything that you have discussed here with us today. and also some of the charts and the slides that you've presented with us. I'm afraid that we will have to finish the session, but I am sure that we will have plenty more of opportunities to collaborate between the different institutions that we have here, and also between the Electric Power Research Institute and the US WEC in the near future. And once again, many thanks, Tom, for coming and sharing with the audience all your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's continue now with the roundtable, Green Industrial Policies, the way ahead. I would like to kindly ask Natalia Collado, Nick Bitzius, Federico Steinberg, Mark van Stiefhout, Michal Meidan, and Cecilia Malmström to take a seat at the stage. Before giving the floor to the moderator, Natalia, I would like to kindly inform you that at the end of this session, there will be the possibility of sending questions to the speakers through the application Slido that I hope you see soon at the screen with the link and the password. If you prefer, you can also do the question with papers. Just ask the hostess that will be around while our speakers are taking the photos. I'm going to introduce briefly Natalia Collado. Natalia is research economist at the Center of Economic Policies of the Business School ESADE. She holds a master's degree in industrial economics and markets from the Carlos III University of Madrid, and is specialized in quantitative economic analysis, regulation, and competition policies. She's especially focused on the energy sector, transport, and telecommunications. Thank you very much to all of you, especially Natalia, that is sure is going to be very good moderator. Just to remember you, you have 1 hour and a half, and I'll leave you with them.
Hi. Thank you so much, Anna, for your kind words and for such a warming welcome. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this roundtable. And please let me find my notes, because with the microphoning, I lost them. But things that happen, right? So just give me 1 second, and I'm sure I'll find it. So sorry for that. Or if I can kindly ask Anna to bring me my phone, because I have it in there. I don't have the Wi-Fi here, so I have my phone. It's in my bag, but in the meantime, I can introduce the table, because since we are 5 distinguished speakers, I want to try to manage the best I can the time we have, and so sorry for that. So what I wanted to say just is that we are living in it was above this. So it's fine. No, I'll try to do my best. I think I left the phone there, but I don't know. We are living in a new era. All these speakers we have before have... Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. That's kind of... Okay, here we go. Well, as I was mentioning, the speakers we hosted before were mentioning the challenges we have ahead and also the opportunities, right? So I wanted also just to mention that we are in a remarkable transformation that will define these decades. We are witnessing an exponential adoption curve for clean energy technologies. Solar energy, batteries, and electric vehicles have not only significantly reduced their cost and mark milestone, they are also fundamentally changing the global industry. So this surge in the adoption of these technologies is signaling a pivotal moment in our quest for sustainability and economic progress. Countries, as we have heard from the previous speakers, are keen to support and accelerate this growth by developing ambitious green industrial policies to drive national development, but also to compete on the global arena. However, the core of our discussion today, or that's the intention at least, goes beyond the immediate horizon of competitive dynamics. It's about imagining a future where climate policies and industrial strategies are inevitably linked. And they promote an economy that is not only green and efficient, but is also resilient and forward-looking. The challenge then is to adopt measures that improve the efficiency of domestic production and ensure that our economic engines are both environmentally sustainable and globally competitive, without resorting to protectionist measures. To shed light on the many impacts of climate policy and pave the way for an industrial policy that meets the needs of our time, we have 5 very distinguished guests here with us today who are highly experienced and knowledgeable in this field. Their different perspectives and backgrounds will enrich the debate, so it's a pleasure for me to introduce all of them. Cecilia Malmström holds a PhD in political science from the University of Gothenburg and is former EU Commissioner for Trade and Home Affairs. She was also European Affairs Minister in the Swedish government and a member of the European Parliament. Currently, she is a non-resident senior fellow in the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. So thank you for being with us today. Michal Meidan is head of China Energy Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Before that, she headed cross-commodity China research at Energy Aspects and headed China Matters, an independent research consultancy providing analysis on the politics of energy in China. Michal also held senior analytical roles at the Eurasia Group and holds a PhD in political science and East Asian studies from Sciences Po Paris. Thank you for being with us today. Federico Steinberg is a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute, a visiting fellow center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and a professor at Madrid's Universidad Autónoma. He's also a special advisor to the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, Josep Borrell. He holds a PhD in economics from the Universidad Autónoma. Welcome, Federico. Mark van Stiphout is currently Deputy Head of Unit in DG Energy in the unit that is responsible for research, innovation, competitiveness, and digitalization. His responsibilities include the digitalization of Energy Action Plan and the Net Zero Industry Act. And he is also involved in the EU's Energy Research and Innovation Agenda and the Energy Union Competitiveness Progress Report. He was also a member of the cabinet of the Commissioner for Energy, Günther Oettinger. Thank you, Mark. And finally, Nick Vitzios, at the other end of the table, is the chairman of Business Europe's Energy and Climate Working Group, which brings together the national federations from across Europe and represents 20 million companies in total. Nick is the head of Brussels office for a Greek company called Mytilineos, who operate one of the few remaining aluminium smelters in the EU, and is also active in the energy sector as a producer and supplier of electricity, a gas trader, and a leading developer of renewable energy sources and storage projects all across the world. So thank you all for being here with us today. Since we have too much to say and we are short of time, we are going to have a first round of interventions from each speaker that I think will help us develop a comprehensive overview of the topic and before engaging in a discussion. So I was going to leave the floor to Cecilia if she wants to start with her intervention.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a true honor to be here today with this distinguished panel and such an important topic, or so many important topics, because they're all interlinked. I thought I would talk a little bit about the transatlantic dimension of this, bringing a good continuation from what Tom said initially, and then, of course, Mark will elaborate, I'm sure, on the more specifics of Europe. In order to deal with this huge challenge that we are facing, there are, of course, lots of tools around. The European has the Green Deal, which is a name for a lot of different acts and legislations in order to achieve the big aim of cutting emissions by 55% to 2030 compared to 1999, and to be climate carbon neutral to 2050. And in this, there are lots of different legislations, and it's sometimes called the Fit for 55 or the Green Energy Plan. And also, in addition to this, we have, as you know, since a long time, the emission trading system. And after the COVID, there was a recovery fund that focused very much on digital, but overall the green transition in order to come back after the COVID. And all this, of course, had to be updated with the current events in the world, and also reflected very much after what the Americans did with the IRA, not the Irish Revolutionary Army, which is the first connotation you get in Europe when you hear IRA, but the Inflation Reduction Act, as Tom spoke about. This is, of course, from a European point of view, a fantastic investment in the green transition, in green energy, in a show that US is coming back after the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement under President Trump, and it is laudable and it should be welcomed. Subsidies, loans, credits, etc., and it will surely help the American transition. But it is discriminatory. From a European point of view, and not only the Europeans complaining, it is not WTO compliant because it focuses on local content, and it also risks, and we've already seen that, it is a little bit too early to evaluate the full impact of this, but a wave of subsidies globally to try to respond to this. It is encouraging European and other companies to move production to the US in exchange of subsidies and tax credits, and this has created tensions within the EU, but also with the rest of the world. And we need to find way forwards to overcome this and to get the best out of it without these conflicts. So the EU response to this was very much the Net Zero Industry Act that should be seen together with lots of other legislations, the Raw Material Act, the reform of the internal market, and response to boost up EU competitiveness, but also to simplify the processes, to simplify the rules, and softening the rather rigid state aid rules that has dominated the European market for decades. And we have seen this happening now, but this also creates tension within the internal market, because some countries with big pockets can afford state subsidies, while others will have more difficulties. And already today, France and Germany are around 70% of all the state aids that are accepted by the European Commission. But the focus is to accelerate carbon capture technology, skills, a joint hydro bank, exchange of information, best practices, etc. In this is very important also the Raw Material Act, which focuses on reducing the dependence on China and make Europe more autonomous. There are goals, which in my view are not very realistic, but still it's always good to have goals on getting more extraction, processing and recycling that should increase in Europe. We have quite a lot of rare earth in Europe, but they're not very accessible, so this will take time. In addition, as I mentioned, there's the reform of the internal market, and also we have entered into force the 1st of October, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that entered into its first phase the 1st of October, which will oblige a reporting, a gradual entry into force, and a reporting of the carbon leakage or the carbon emissions of a few sensitive products. The US and many others do not like this, but I think it is important, even if you can discuss the details of the CBAM mechanism, and it will have to be adjusted slightly as it gets fully implemented. But the EU is the first mover here, and we see that countries all over the world are now trying to find ways to price carbon in different ways, which is one of the most important tools that we have. So what has the EU and the US done in this? Well, mainly two things. First, we have an attempt to agree on an EU-US trade agreement on minerals, which is not really a trade agreement, but it is an agreement to, in the future, when there are minerals to trade, there will be no export restrictions, and to facilitate also the sale of recycled batteries, etc. Because there is a provision in the IRA that in order to get tax credits, you need to have an FTA, a free trade agreement, or to be a partner. Batteries need to be made with a certain percentage of critical minerals processed in the US or in a partner country. So the EU and the US are negotiating since March a kind of agreement here, which would also be focused on working globally on recycling and on finding joint ways of investing in third countries and to reduce the dependence on China. Japan already has an agreement with the US on this, which is sort of the template, and other countries are also approaching Indonesia and others to see how this goes. It should be quite simple to do this, but there has been complications on labor rights in third countries, etc. The other part is the GASA, another of these acronyms, which is an agreement, it's not an agreement, but it's an attempt to find an agreement to move forward on the tariffs on steel and aluminium under the Section 301 that President Trump imposed on Europe and other allies in 2017 for national security reasons. And the EU, and I had the privileged or the unfortunate position, depending on how you define it, to be commissioner on that time, we imposed countermeasures on goods worth $3.6 million. When Biden came into office, there was a suspension on this, but introduction of quotas on steel and an agreement to try to work together to find an agreement on sustainable steel, putting tariffs on steels and aluminium that come from dirty production in non-market economies. This has been negotiated for a while. The deadlines have been postponed, and there's a new deadline at the end of the year. This is complicated because the US wants the EU to agree on non-WTO compliant measures on China, and the quotas will still remain for the EU. So first of all, these tariffs were illegal in WTO context, but they will still remain as quotas. So negotiations are continuing, but this is complex, and the US tends to see this as an alternative to CBAM as well. And now the Senate just promoted a bill to punish countries who are not doing carbon clean policies with China. So what should the EU do on this? And I'll wrap up, sorry, Natalia. Well, we must work with partners to try to find out what is a good subsidy. As we said this morning, there are ways, or there are times when the market do not fulfill all that we want to achieve. So subsidies could be a good thing, but we need to make sure that they don't do harm to others. And today we see a race here which can increase fragmentation of the world, actually. So, and the EU should not introduce massive subsidies like the US, but rather investment in general in innovation and research. We have seen that in the past that it works much better. There's a lot to do in beefing up the internal market. A carbon club has been discussed. There are lots of, and we can come back to that in the discussion, there are lots of actors discussing different ways how a carbon club could work. I think the EU is preparing to propose a global partnership at the COP28 to work on minerals. There is, of course, a joint interest for a green production and to reduce dependence on China. And somehow both the EU and the US need to be flexible to find a solution here. The clock is ticking. The EU is entering into European Parliament elections next spring, and that will also make a new commission and a new head president of the European Council. The US, I think, have elections as well. I think I read that sometime next year, right? That could also complicate matters, and it will certainly make the silly season or the election time as from next year complicated to reach agreement. The transatlantic friendship is important in these times for geopolitical reasons. We do not need a split. Clear divisions between Washington and Brussels will only benefit someone in the Kremlin and others. But there is also a great push for the EU to not agree to things that would undermine the global trading system, the WTO rules, and I think it will be very difficult to find agreement, and the most likely way is that this will be pushed after the elections, unfortunately. I'll stop there. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but life is tough right now.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I think it was a great first view of what we have in our hands today, and I hope during the dialogue part we go into more detail in this question. You have mentioned the US, EU, and briefly China, and taking that note, I want to give the floor to Michal so she could enlighten us with their policies.
Should I try now? Now it's working. Good. I feel like I'm talking about the country that should not be named, but Cecilia has named. So I will talk about China and sort of its role in new energy supply chains, where it sits in this picture. It feels like industrial policies, the IRA and the EU Critical Minerals Act and others are perhaps 1 or 2 years old. China's policies are not new. They're certainly not WTO compliant, but they're also not a grand scheme or this sort of big picture to dominate the world. And I want to talk a little bit about China's first mover advantage and some of the disadvantages that have come with that. I'll also talk in 3 parts. We talked about trilemmas in 3 parts earlier this morning. I want to make sort of 3 main points. So the first is unpacking a little bit what China has been doing. It's, as I said, first mover advantage, but also disadvantage, because when thinking about industrial policies, what China has been doing for very, very long, there are potentially lessons for the West on what to do or what not to do. But first of all, that China's kind of dominance or foray into new energy supply chains and critical minerals dates back actually almost a century. I mean, rare earths mining in China dates back to the 1920s, and a lot of the exploration and processing began in the 70s and the 80s. It began by attracting foreign companies into China, digesting foreign technologies and making use of them, scaling them up and adapting them. But the Chinese government at the time also faced lots of issues with illegal mining, with pollution, with all the side effects of rare earths processing that is not necessarily pretty or very, very clean, which it sought to regulate. And we talked as well earlier about regulation and having sort of very transparent and predictable regulatory frameworks. They were not that in China, and they remain not very predictable even for Chinese companies in China. Increasingly now, of course, that has global ramifications that feel a little bit like economic coercion when we think about graphite, gallium, germanium, and some of the export restrictions that China has been imposing. But really, it has also gone hand in hand with an attempt in China to regulate that sector and to regulate those activities on rare earths. If we think about electric vehicles and batteries, again, these are policies that now date back over 20 years that were as much about leapfrogging ICE technologies, existing technologies, a recognition in China that they wouldn't be able to compete with conventional car makers. It was also about energy security, and it was sort of a long process of developing the innovation, the know-how of building up batteries and an EV industry. Again, there was a lot of attracting foreign expertise and then digesting or taking the IP and using it domestically with know-how and cheap inputs economies of scale, which have been critical in China, and a large domestic market. So all of these have worked together, the access to export markets, a big and promising domestic market, but the ability to scale up. And I think the relevance for Europe, of course, is that the scale is much bigger when the EU works together. Unfortunately, the UK has decided no longer to be in the EU and exploit that scale. But of course, these are all things that have gone together and worked in China's favor. Solar panels have been a very different story. They started off as an export market, but then when tariffs were imposed and countervailing duties were imposed by the EU, it was picked up as a domestic market. But in 2010, when I was speaking to Chinese counterparts about the solar industry, they were saying this is an industry that's not suitable for China. We can't really adapt and deploy solar in China. And of course, 10, 13 years later, they have the biggest solar deployment sort of globally. And of course, it is suitable for Chinese circumstances. But they have taken that industry and used it domestically and learned to adapt it. And sort of again, wind started off as a domestic industry that has grown with some very similar characteristics. But if there is a second thing that we should pay attention to is about the use of subsidies. IP appropriation or IP theft has been a big part of the story, and we focus now especially with pending EU investigations and potential tariffs on Chinese EVs and wind turbines. There have been a lot of state support and state subsidies. There's also been a lot of innovation. And I think when we look at China, we tend to assume the worst in terms of innovation and practices, and that is not the case. I think we have to recognize, again, for these industries, not all industrial policies were equal. Again, there was a lot of cheap input, be it labor, electricity, subsidized or not. There was, again, the IP issue. But there was also a policy innovation and actual technology innovation of scaling up, of creating ecosystems, industrial parks, labor, know-how. All of that has become a very formidable ecosystem in China. And some of it, again, we can learn from. A lot of innovation. Mostly sort of China hasn't done a lot of disruptive innovation so far. It's been mostly on scale-up, on manufacturing, less so on design. But the ecosystems around EVs in China are really interesting. And again, some of that localized innovation, we should pay attention to it. Also, I think we shouldn't just assume that China can't do anything. It was said this morning shouldn't fall into hyperbole and we need to maintain the nuance. Equally, when I hear in the West people saying, we've lost the EV, wind, solar race to China, I don't think that's the case. There's a lot of innovation on design, on recycling, on life cycles that can and should happen in the EU. And most importantly, perhaps, let's not lose sight of what is the race. The race is decarbonization as quickly and as cheaply as possible. That's where the industrial race, I think, comes into the mix. And so the final point is about these trade-offs. I think we have to recognize that China is indispensable in these supply chains today. Market concentration is a huge risk and we need to diversify, but as Cecilia already said, rare earths will take time to develop. Alternative supplies will take time to develop. It doesn't mean we don't need to develop them, we do, but we have to think very carefully about how it is that we do it and what is the cost of nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, or trying to exclude China. Things like the foreign entity of concern in the US are all issues that will, at the end of the day, or could make the energy transition more costly. We know that costs in China can be a third or even less than they are in the West. The scale-up of wind and solar in China has greatly facilitated the energy transition and the ability to reduce costs globally. We need to take advantage of that, while also being careful about the risks associated with dependence on China. We can come to that a bit more in the Q&A, but we also have to be clear about what are our policy goals and what are we worried about? What does the EU and what do the US want? Do we want industrial competitiveness and protectionism? Because that does not come hand in hand with the cheapest and fastest route to decarbonization, unfortunately. I think we also have to be cognizant of what it is that we're worried about when we're thinking about China. Are we worried about coercive policies and the use of market concentration for its benefit? Or are we worried about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and what the aftermath could look like? because the policy responses to the two are and should be very, very different, and the risk assessment should be very different, and all of those feel like they're being confused and combined right now in a number of policies that don't necessarily make sense, or at least as was said this morning, there are trade-offs between these policy choices. So finally, and I will wrap up because I think I'm way over time, what could Europe do? I think it's very difficult to give these generic answers, but I think Europe, we need to be a bit more methodic and careful in our thinking. I think we need to identify the main pain points, not just say China controls cobalt, lithium, tin, aluminium, manganese, rare earths. I mean, the list goes on and on forever. So let's recreate all of those in every single country. No, let's think about, again, where are the risks? What do we need to do? Where are the advantages in Europe on innovation, on recycling? What do we add to the table that doesn't exist right now? And how do we push China to become cleaner, greener, and even more innovative? Competition can and should be harnessed for both industrial competitiveness and a faster decarbonization. And last point, I think the other thing that China has done quite well is have a holistic view. And I think governments need a holistic view of the energy transition. This is a society-wide transformation. We cannot think about it in silos of energy, of industry, of foreign policy. We need to think through the trade-offs and the implications holistically.
Thank you so much, Michal. I think we now have not all the players in the table, but the key players. We have the US, the EU. We will then go into that. But now I want to give the floor to Federico to know a little bit more about this new context, this new geopolitical context. What are the consequences and whatever you...
Well, thank you very much. Does it work? Yes. Just let me know if I need another one. Oh, now it works. Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to give an overview of the general geopolitical situation and then bring it a bit down to our current discussion. But a couple of things have already been mentioned, so I'll try to go a bit faster. I want to make 3 points, basically. The first has to do with what we really know about the fragmentation of the global political economy, because that's on the title. There's a lot of discussion, but I think we have to look at some of the details of this discussion. Second, why what's going on is really pushing the way of thinking in the European Union about these issues and highlighting some problems. Cecilia mentioned some of them, so a little bit more on that, particularly when understanding what economic security means for the European Union. I think strategic autonomy has been very much discussed these last years, open strategic autonomy, but economic security is going to be the key concern going forward. And third, some hypothesis of what the EU would do in the next years, which is similar to what you just mentioned. So first, on the global political economy situation, my impression is that when we look in 2050 back to history, historians will say that around this year or this decade, there was this shift in the global political economy from this world of trust in interdependence, neoliberal hegemonic ideas, et cetera, globalization, towards something which is going to be a bit different. I wouldn't call it deglobalization. I think that's not where we're going, but a different moment in which the balance between regulation and the market is going to be changed towards more intervention. And this is something that originates in the world of ideas, takes some time to get to policies, and takes some time to get into the data. So basically, with the global financial crisis, the Trump trade wars, COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc., all these geopolitical events and the rise of tension between the West and the rest, or China-US, we can talk about this in more detail. What we're seeing is that, particularly in the United States, there's been a radical change in dominant ideas about what the US should do in economic policy, and this is quite structural. It was more violent with Trump. It could be more violent again if Trump wins in 24, and that's a very, very important element for EU policies going down the road, and we'll probably discuss a bit more. Cecilia already mentioned it. But basically, this prominence of industrial policy, subsidies, protectionism, neglect of international agreements, the WTO and others, is very entrenched in US thinking, I think particularly on China. We have a number of initiatives like the discussions on export controls, or the real export controls. Also, the outbound investment screening. The Biden administration is really seriously thinking, or has really thought and imposed some criteria on who can and cannot invest in China, and this is about private companies in the US. So this is really a level of interference that is, I think, unseen. Also, we had regulations on artificial intelligence. So in general, the mood is changing, and this is also arriving to Europe. Normally, these big changes in ideas tend to start more in the US and then be transferred to the rest of the world. And in Europe, we are already there. But in practice, we've seen these new policies. But if we look at the data, the peak of globalization was probably around 2007 for goods as an exports to GDP. Then it kind of stabilized, and then it went up and down a bit. But that's perfectly compatible with a lot of dynamism and growth in trade in services, particularly those associated with technology and digital services. And at the same time, less dynamism or even deglobalization in some elements that have to do with manufacturing trade. And that is also compatible with new trade agreements. And here the European Union is pushing for being able to increase economic security through more diversification. Someone said this morning that having one supplier is very risky. The EU is really in opposition to the US, trying to do more trade deals to actually increase trade with the like-minded countries, the ones that can be trustable sources, whereas in the US, the discussion is we're not going to do trade agreements full stop. I mean, maybe they will do something very small with the UK at some point. Unlikely, I think. And maybe they do something with Taiwan, which is, that has nothing to do with trade and everything to do with geopolitics, right? So in a way, I think we're looking at a world in which companies will have to readapt a bit to this new scenario, and in which you are not going to be able to trust global multilateral rules probably anymore, and this is very unfortunate. Cecilia and me, and I guess most of us really like the WTO, but we have to be realistic there. Of course, in the energy sector, we know that energy is too special, and it always has had a different kind of regulation, more intervention at some point, but also within the global trading system, different rules. So again, here are important elements to reconsider. But I think we're moving more and more into a world of a bigger role of the state, more regulation in general, and more risk. Now, the European Union in this context is not very well equipped, and I would say for mainly two reasons. One is, I would say, ideological. Europe has embraced and was born as a project with a DNA of free trading and against, nationalism and imperialism, and we have both nationalism and neo-imperialism back in the global geopolitical agenda, and therefore we have to, change the chip, as we say in Spanish sometimes, change the mentality, and then there are institutional problems for something which is not the United States of Europe or a full fiscal union, Cecilia mentioned some of them, to respond, not in terms of the amounts of money on the table. If we look and compare the IRA with all the initiatives in Europe, Bruegel has a great paper here, more or less is the same amount, even though it's true that the IRA is not capped, so it might be, as we heard from Tom this morning, spends more money. It's more about the speed of implementation, the tax credit, the flexibility, and also the fact that the EU is about the rule of law, and we have to be agreeing on every step in order to facilitate and implement and speed up the process, and this is being complicated. And another element is that we lack an internal market that is particularly integrated in services. We've been discussing this for decades, but still here. And when we talk about geopolitical rivalry and we compare the European market with the US or with China or with India, we have to still work on the Dolores project, 3.0, 4.0. Mario Draghi is preparing a report on this. Enrico Letta, another one. So let's hope the Italians save the day for the European internal market. Let's see what happens. But more importantly, I think there's an opportunity for the European Union in terms of thinking about economic security. And here, trade-offs are very important, but you mentioned basically what I was going to say. If we really want to go fast, and Chinese EVs are cheaper, what do we do, right? Do we put tariffs on them as the Commission started investigation or not? And if we do that, is that WTO compatible or not? Of course it's not, so it opens up a problem if we want to, renegotiate a new WTO system. So again, these are going to be problematic, but overall I think there's an opportunity in the European Union because of this context of discussing a deepness of the fiscal union, which is something that it's what we need. We need European money for European public goods, and the energy transition is clearly one of these necessary European public goods. Probably another one is going to be the reconstruction of Ukraine. Another one probably is going to be investment in technology, but technology and energy are the two transitions that we're discussing together. And here, probably with the reform of the fiscal rules at the European level, but more importantly, with the discussion and the lessons of Next Generation EU, there might be a window of opportunity for joint financing at the European level. So the European Union issues debt as the EU to finance some project at the EU level. Then we have to discuss what we do. And this eliminates the problem of Germany or France having more money than other member states for subsidies. Here, I think it's important to be clear that state aid rules can be rethink, can be discussed, but we should keep them there and be careful about a level playing field within the internal market. So to conclude, probably I would say in the EU, we're going to see some new developments in the next years. Reactive, and this is kind of unfortunate because basically we are all holding for the American election in December 24. I live in Washington, and Cecilia spends a lot of time in Washington, and Tom also discussed some of the American elements in the agenda. If there's a continuation of the Biden administration, probably this transatlantic collaboration will continue. But again, the isolationist rhetoric and policies in the US are going to continue. But if there's a change in the White House, we really have to think about how to accelerate our own autonomy and security in the part of probably defense and security, hard security, which is something we are not discussing that much because NATO is still with us and the security umbrella of the US is still with us. But the conversation, I think, will move towards that need to deepen European integration, and also there's an enlargement discussion on the table that we can also tackle on the debate. But that's probably for another roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fede. You have mentioned that we have a window of opportunity as well, and I want to invite Mark to tell us about how the Green Deal and how the Green Industrial Plan could be an opportunity also for Europe. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here and to sit in such a panel. And it's not going to be easy still to add something to everything that has already been said, because a lot of the things that we are currently doing have already been mentioned by Cecilia, by Michel, and also by Federico. So I'll try to maybe deepen a bit of those things and then give you also from my perspective an insight into what the challenges are as we go into the future. I think if we talk about the challenges for, let's say, the industry in Europe and how do we combine across this trilemma of competitiveness and affordability, sustainability and security of supply, how do we make sure that the Green Deal is also a strategy for growth and jobs in Europe, which it is, then I would like to start with elaborating a little bit on the Green Deal Industrial Plan that the Commission published at the beginning of this year. That has 4 dimensions, basically. One is about regulatory certainty and giving a regulatory framework, on the one hand, for the, let's say, competitive supply of energy through a review of the internal market legislation. So that's going on as we speak, and we hope that we can still reach an agreement on that targeted reform before the end of the year. It is also about creating more certainty for investments in manufacturing in Europe, and also in supply of critical raw materials. So we have the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act. And maybe I'll go a bit more into detail about those things in a second. So let's park this for a minute. Then the second dimension, or the second element of that Green Deal Industrial Plan, is about funding. And so on the one hand, we have the temporary crisis and transition framework, so loosening the state aid rules for a temporary time, in particular also for projects that risk moving elsewhere if they would not benefit from state aid. So this is really also in response to the IRA, to make sure that we in Europe can support industries to make sure that they invest here when they are in a specific sectors, that is clean tech, so solar panels, wind, heat pumps, electrolyzers, and batteries. And there are more things around funding, but I think this is the most, let's say, direct and impactful. Then there was a proposal called STEP for the Sustainable Transition for Europe, widening or easing the rules to, for example, provide through regional funds investment support, not just for SMEs, but also for big industrial manufacturing investment plans or projects. And the Innovation Fund. I think this was also mentioned already. The Innovation Fund has a budget of, depending on the CO2 price, but between now and 2030 of something like 40 billion euros. And there we've seen a shift already going from, let's say, supporting projects that were really focusing on deployment, like offshore wind farms, for example, floating wind, these type of things, going into support for manufacturing. For example, in one of the last rounds, there was support for 2 PV manufacturing plants. We're setting up the hydrogen bank, so having an auction, which is really the first time that we do something like this at EU level, to do an auction to support hydrogen production in Europe, based on a premium that is then the support for the manufacturing, for the production project. So that is around funding. So a lot is happening there, and then 2 other dimensions: skills. We see more and more that skills is an issue, that it is really hampering scaling up manufacturing in Europe. So we need to pay a lot of attention to it. It is part of the Net Zero Industry Act, for example, but it is really becoming more and more a self-standing policy to make sure that in Europe we have the right skills to guide, basically, or make the Green Deal happen. Because in the end, it depends on skilled people that actually need to put solar panels on roofs or put wind turbines in the sea. And then, of course, the trade dimension. I think this was mentioned already. At EU level, we still want to insist and promote free trade, because we think that this is the best way to fight against climate change. It is a global challenge, so it needs a global approach. But at the same time, we are not naive, and this, let's say, seeing that trade together with the other dimensions of the Green Deal Industrial Plan also shows how we are making moves in other parts, in particular in this Net Zero Industry Act, for example. So maybe going a bit more into detail there. So one of the core elements there is faster permitting for investments in manufacturing in strategic net zero technologies. We're currently in the Council and in the Parliament discussing that legislation. We hope and we are confident that we will be able to reach an agreement before the Parliament goes into elections, so before the end of February is basically the deadline that has been given to us by when we need to reach an agreement. And there are a few things that are quite heavily discussed, but I think it is fair to say that the ambition in terms of permitting, giving faster permitting for manufacturing projects, is not really one of them. So we put there, for strategic net zero technologies, basically an obligation on the administrations to give such projects a permit within a year, and then it can even be faster depending on the size. And this is quite generally agreed. So we don't see this as something that is very heavily discussed. And I think that's already a serious achievement that will really make a difference in getting these manufacturing projects off the ground in Europe. Things that are more discussed is what do we actually then consider strategic net zero technologies? And there is and also net zero technologies in general. What are the type of things that we actually want to promote with this Net Zero Industry Act? And just bear in mind that the focus from the outset was really clean tech manufacturing. So again, PV panels, wind, batteries, electrolyzers, the equipment, manufacturing the components of an electrolyzer, not putting the electrolyzer in place itself. And this has been quite a discussion in the Council and in the Parliament, and also, I think, with the stakeholders. How far do we actually want to go with this Net Zero Industry Act? And I think there is a legitimate question when companies ask, okay, but why is this only for manufacturing and not for the actual production of hydrogen, for example? Or why is this only for manufacturing heat pumps and not for producing e-fuels or sustainable aviation fuels? And this distinction was made because we want to basically step up our manufacturing base in Europe, so that was really the aim. Whereas, of course, we are going through a transition of all of these industries. The energy-intensive industry, the petrochemical industry, the steel industry, all of them need to go through a transition, need to invest in cleaner production processes. We think that from a point of view of going through, in particular, the faster permitting, there is a big difference between putting up a hall where you manufacture batteries or putting up a petrochemical installation. So maybe the way you want to give those things permits, there is a good reason why for some things you maybe want to not put pressure on an administration to do these things very fast. Of course, we emphasize that going faster doesn't mean that it changes the nature of the thoroughness of that permit process, but at the same time, the administrative capacity is limited. So you cannot expect somebody to do everything, and making everything a priority also means that nothing becomes a priority. But this is something that's really very heavily discussed both in the Parliament and in the Council. And like I said, from a transition point of view and what needs to happen, I think it's also a very legitimate concern and question from those, let's say, energy-intensive industries to say we also need to have that type of policies to support it. I think the discussion now is, does that fit in the Net Zero Industry Act, or does that require something else? And yeah, here your guess is as good as mine. This is really being discussed as we speak. And then, so this is one of the key issues when it comes to what is being discussed now. Another thing that is very heavily discussed is the, sorry, now I'm losing my notes because I'm not. Yeah. No, so one other thing that's heavily discussed is the provisions on the chapter that's called access to market. So that is about how can we include quality criteria in auctions for renewables or in public procurement procedures, so that we actually reward higher quality products, which of course we then assume come from Europe because we are good at producing high quality products. This of course needs to be done striking a careful balance on the one hand between the high ambition we have in deploying renewables, the high targets we have. We have just agreed to achieve 42.5% of renewables in the EU's energy mix by 2030, with the ambition to actually make this 45%, which translates into something like 70 or 75% in electricity. So this is a huge ambition, and this needs to be done at the lowest cost possible. And but at the same time, we want to make sure that we, with all these investments, with all these deployment, also create resilient and sustainable supply chains. So if this is about short-term gains to undercutting long-term viability of industries, then it's not good. And this is where we try to find a balance by allowing for quality criteria that link to resilience, that link to environmental sustainability. And this is, of course, very much discussed at the moment because many countries have different views on what actually that balance is between fast deployment of renewables on the one hand and promoting resilient industries and supply chains for these technologies. So this is, in a nutshell, a bit what's happening at the moment. Cecilia already said this Green Deal Industrial Plan is one thing that is part of a big pack, so I don't think we should compare the Green Deal Industrial Plan on its own with what's happening elsewhere. There is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism as part of the whole ETS system. We have targets for renewables, we have targets for energy efficiency, we have targets for electric cars, so there is a lot of different things happening at the same time. And I think also looking at the future, what is really the challenge is how do we make all these things go forward at the same time? How do we strike a balance in many dimensions? Like Federico said, on the one hand, the world outside the EU is changing in terms of less and less open trade, whereas the EU's being, let's say our basic state of mind is an internal market where we trade openly. So how do we make sure that we can do that while at the same time, for example, allowing member states to come up with quality criteria that promote resilience or that promote sustainability, but do that within an internal market so that it's not like every member state is going to come up with its own criteria to promote its own industry. And how do we, like you said, if we have 27 strategies on clean tech manufacturing, that's also not very useful. If every country in the EU now says we want to produce our own PV panels and manufacture them, then we're not getting anywhere. It's really also there the need to cooperate, to coordinate, while at the same time making sure that the basic internal market still works, that I think is really going to be a big challenge. And just to illustrate this with a few figures, I think on the one hand, last year was a record year in installing wind capacity, something like 16 gigawatt. It was a record year in installing PV panels, 42 gigawatt peak of an overall of something like 210 that we now have accumulated in Europe. But at the same time, all of this is not enough. If we want to reach our 2030 targets, we need to have 37 gigawatts of wind per year, for example. So meeting those targets and meeting those in a way, because then we're in 2030 and then we're only at 42.5% renewable. So that's not even, we're not nearly close to our 2050 ambitions by then. So making sure that we on the one hand meet this high ambition in renewables or in just the transition of the energy system as we have set out to do, but at the same time do this in a way that gives a long-term viability to the industry, that keeps the industry in the EU competitive. This is really going to be a challenge that is going to keep us busy between now and 2030. I'm pretty sure about that. And I think we can take confidence in what we have achieved, right? If we look at where we are now in terms of the share of renewables in the system and how we were talking about this, I think in 2008, 2009, when we were talking about 20% renewables in the energy system, many people were saying, okay, but this is ludicrous. We don't have storage technologies. We will not be able to manage this. We are in 2023. We're doing perfectly fine. We're breaking records, but all these records are not enough. So I think, we find confidence in what we have achieved, but we cannot get easy because getting an agreement on all these Green Deal legislation is really just the beginning. And the challenge comes in the coming years where we really need to show to the citizens and the industry that this can be realized and achieved and implemented in a consistent way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and with such a comprehensive presentation that some of the questions have already been answered, I hope. And I want to welcome Nick to give us a perspective on the business sector and how all this context is affecting the industry. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalia. And in a lot of ways, I would say my job has been made easy for me because we've had, from my co-panelists, a fantastic overview of everything that's going on, the geopolitical situation, the US policies, the Chinese policy, and of course the European response as well. So what I will try to do is to bring everything together and discuss how the European business sector is dealing with this, what we think of the EU response so far, and then what else we would like to see as well moving forwards in order to make sure that this transition can be a success on the ground. And I think the first thing to say here is we're actually really glad to see that this discussion about green industrial policies is finally being discussed and finally being recognized. Because if we think about what the EU is trying to do with the Green Deal, it is nothing short of an industrial revolution. We are planning to completely revolutionize the way we power our entire society. We're planning to change the way that we produce the basic goods that we use in our everyday lives. And I think that this was one part that was kind of missing from the discussion that we've had in Europe over the past few years. We've had a lot of targets being set, 2030, 2050. We've had a strengthening of the ETS. We've had all sorts of reporting obligations, standards, definitions, and all of these were necessary. But we need to focus as well on the business case and bringing these investments into the market. And it wasn't yet quite clear how all these aspects came together and led to this business case to get these decarbonized low-carbon technologies into the system. And that was when the US came along with the Inflation Reduction Act. We heard a lot about it this morning from Tom, fantastic presentation. And there's a lot of, the US really focused on driving this business case and trying to make sure these investments come into the market. And there's a lot of difficult aspects to untangle here. We heard from Cecilia from the trade aspect, WTO concerns, and I think there is a need for a discussion of clarifying when is a subsidy good, what we do about the increasing protectionism that we see. And I think there are definitely people on this panel who are far more qualified to talk about the trade aspects than I am. What I would like to focus on instead is the impact that this has had on investments in the USA. We've heard earlier on it had a massive effect in the space of just a year. We've seen a barrage of investments along the whole value chain, the clean tech value chain, from the raw materials right down to things like batteries and hydrogen. And we need to see if and how we can do the same thing in Europe as well. So far, you can look at hydrogen as a good example of this. We have some very ambitious targets in Europe to become global leaders in hydrogen. It's a good target, a good aspiration. We've had a lot of projects that are being announced, but they're struggling to reach that final investment decision. It's about 4% of announced hydrogen projects actually end up going ahead with the FID. So I think there are certainly things that we can learn from the IRA. This is not a discussion that is all about subsidies. It was mentioned just before that if you look at the headline figure from the IRA and you compare it to what we have in Europe, the various funds, member state funding as well, it's actually extremely comparable. What the US has done is it's an extremely simple system, and it's also they've managed to pass this message through to the business sector that we want your investments to happen in Europe, in the USA. In Europe, we have a few push factors at the moment that are driving these investments away. Some of it is to do with the geopolitical situation, the energy crisis and all of this. We have to solve it. Some of it has to do as well with policy, things we can do to improve it. We can come onto that later on, but we need to bring all of these together and really create that business case moving forward. And I think it's fair to say the Commission has recognized this and is acting on it already. We heard about the Green Deal Industrial Plan. And from our perspective, the focus on permitting, especially in both the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act, is really, really important, and we fully support these proposals. It's one of the biggest barriers for bringing these investments into the market. If you look at a wind project, it can take 8, 9, 10 years just to get the permits before you start building. For a mine, it can be up to 20 to do the mining for the raw materials. So great proposals from the Commission. We need to make sure that during the trilogues now, it's kept, the ambition is kept, really important for us. There is more that we would like to see in order to make sure that we have this strong green industrial policy, but we can move on, I think, to talk about that later on in this discussion. Thank you.
I think we have covered a lot of topics, and mainly we have been talking about the carrots in green industrial policies, subsidies, incentive, etc. And now for this more brief interactive part of the session, I want to start focusing on CBAM, that it has been mentioning a few times during your interventions, but I want to focus on that for the questions. I'm going to ask you to be brief, please, because we have also some questions from the audience that maybe if we have time, would like to address. So in that regard, I wanted to ask you, Fede, first, is CBAM, you have kind of signaling before in your intervention, but is a signal in favor of green protectionism or a global leadership role for the EU in the fight against climate change?
Well, very briefly, I think that the EU has made a big effort to try to make it WTO compatible, but nevertheless, many emerging markets are going to say it's not, and we'll have to discuss on the dispute settlement mechanism how it ends up. It's true that the EU with CBAM is signaling something that I think is important, and when you talk to the people in the US, they recognize it, which is this is the way that we should use to regulate and put a price. The Americans normally don't like taxation and pricing of emissions. They prefer subsidies. But there's an ongoing discussion in the US about how to make CBAM compatible with their initiatives, and I think this is a good news. On the other hand, I think that if the EU doesn't take the leadership on this, who will? So here I'm very much in favor of what you presented as, having the leadership role that the EU sometimes still plays on these issues. Nevertheless, I think it's going to be complicated, and we're not going to be able to have something that is a global agreement of this sort. But Cecilia probably knows also about this.
Yeah, maybe we can jump into that and focus on what are the challenges and how can we make this less, let's say, conflictive.
Well, the challenges are huge. I think China and India have already brought it to the WTO, and we know the skepticism from the US. And also many countries who will be affected by steel, aluminium, cement, and the others in the developing world. They would like to comply, but they can't because they don't have the infrastructure. So it's very important that the CBAM, and there are discussions with the Commission is leading with these countries to help them in that transition to invest in the infrastructure, making it possible to fulfill it. Ideally, we would have a global carbon tax. The African Union the other day called for this, for instance. I don't think that is possible, though. So we need to find a way where CBAM, as the first mover, is actually moving things a lot all over the world. There are different things popping up on emission trading systems and on carbon fees, and these initiatives from the US Senate is in that direction. So we need to find a way to sort of have a peace clause or a mutual recognition mechanism that we don't punish countries who try to do the same thing with slightly different methods, because then we can really harm the transition. Ideally, this would be done in WTO or in OECD or G20. We could still push for that, but we need to find some mechanism of peace clause and mutual recognition. And that's the only way to avoid big trade tensions that would be harmful for the green transition.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And with that in mind, I want to ask Michal how China is going to be affected by that and how is responding to it.
I mean, funnily enough, I think to a certain degree the threat of CBAM right now is more impactful for China than at least a CBAM that would be full of loopholes that the Chinese have been very good at working around and finding. Because the official response has very much been, take it to the WTO, we will not, we don't abide by all these protectionist policies. But the reality is that the CBAM was one of the issues that spurred or that sort of gave additional momentum to China's own emissions trading system. There's been a huge amount of debate within Chinese industries how to decarbonize, about green steel, chemicals, and as CBAM ratchets up, there is greater incentive to add those into China's own ETS and to find solutions with inside of China. We're still a long way off and there's still a lot to be done, but that threat has actually been very powerful and significant in moving China along the kind of decarbonization process.
Thank you, Michal. And now we have the perspective from the different countries, institutions, and how it's going to affect multilateralism, for example. But I want to ask Nick, how is this new mechanism affecting companies? How are they reacting to it? And your perspective in this regard.
I mean, it's a big change, and I think the background has been touched upon already, that when we introduced the ETS back in 2005, the idea was very much that it would spur similar actions in other countries, and that we would soon end up with something at least resembling a global carbon price, to make sure that you have that level playing field on the global level as well. 20 years later, that hasn't happened yet. I mean, we are seeing some interesting initiatives. That's positive, as was mentioned in other countries. But certainly none of them yet come close to the ETS in either the scope and, most importantly, the price that it creates for the competing industries. So the CBAM is coming in now. The biggest challenge from the European business perspective is the difference in cost that is going to be created. So when the CBAM is fully phased in, the cost of producing steel in Europe will be about 30% more expensive than anywhere else in the world. For aluminium, it will be 50%. And then you'll have similar cost differences for anything else that is added to the CBAM, and of course, downstream impacts as well. So we need to make sure that the CBAM is working correctly. Very important point by Michal. We need to make sure that there's no loopholes in there. We need to look at circumvention. That is one point that we have flagged as Business Europe, that we can further improve that situation, make sure that there are no loopholes there. We have a big unsolved issue with the exports, where that's a big challenge on WTO rules as well, where somehow we have to find a solution where, when we're making the products that we're producing in Europe this much more expensive, we cannot then lose the export markets. I mean, that's bad for the European economy. It's bad for the climate as well, if we want to be producing green products in Europe. And the third sort of concern or risk that we need to look at, that I would flag, is for the companies that are actually importing. There's a lot of concern now that the reporting is starting to make sure that they have accurate data from installations that are producing things on the other side of the world. So there are a lot of uncertainties there. What we're happy with as Business Europe, something that we asked for, is that we have a trial period now over the next 2 years. And then after that, we will have a gradual introduction of the CBAM. So that gives us a good opportunity to see how everything's working. Discussing something in theory is very different to seeing it in practice. No one knows how exactly this will work, but the way that we've designed it, the trial period and the phase-in, at least gives us an opportunity to make sure everything is working as intended and make the adjustments that we need to make moving forwards.
Thank you, Nick. I think it's really important also to have to take into account how it's affecting traditional industries, because in Europe we have, as you mentioned, a steel, automotive sector, really powerful. And in that sense, I want to ask Mark, how in this new Green Industrial Plan, we focus on green technologies, right? But how are we thinking, or how are we going to act in decarbonizing the traditional sector? How are we going to tackle this issue, given this framework?
Yeah, right. Now, I don't think there's one easy answer to that, right? I think it comes back to what I said before. We have let's say we have the legislation with all the targets, and it includes the CBAM. It includes, for example, also for aviation and for maritime. And there are also two sectors where that's very global, and where through the EU ETS we try to trigger a global change, and where we had a very bad experience, of course, with aviation, I think around 2010 or 2011. So I think that we have very much learned from that in what is now at the table, and what has now been agreed to really act, let's say, within the EU, and look across the border of the EU at the same time. And like Nick said, look at making sure that those two go hand in hand, and that the implementation of how this is done within the EU needs to be, let's say, rock solid next to what happens internationally. But what we've done is agreed on a lot of legislation, set targets, etc., create instruments, also funding instruments. But the real discussion now is, I think, how are we practically going to make that transition happen? And this is not something that you can talk about in very generic terms, right? For what is needed for petrochemicals or what is needed for wind turbine manufacturing is very, very different. And even within, let's say, that clean tech, in the Net Zero Industry Act, we put solar and wind, let's say, in the same category of strategic technology, but the starting point is extremely different. And what works for wind, how we had this wind support measures that, or this wind support strategy that came out end of October, that was really aimed at putting up a few things very quickly to make sure that this competitive edge that we have in the wind manufacturing industry in Europe is kept. Whereas in PV, we need to take a much longer term view in terms of building up, again, a manufacturing capacity where I think, we have let's say, high-class innovation in Europe, but we don't have much of that manufacturing left. And so the starting point is very, very different. I think the same if we look into steel or petrochemicals. In some of those things, we are extremely strong in Europe. And also, let's not forget the crucial role that these sectors play in the value chain for all these clean technologies that we need. But I think what we have started and what also the President announced with her State of the European Union in September is we need transition dialogues with all these key industries. We really need to, in the coming years, design sector-made policies that combine the funding instruments, the regulatory measures that look at things like permitting for specific sector, for specific issues, also along the value chain, because this is, I think, like I said, there is no easy answer. It's going to be something that is a high priority for the Commission in the coming years, but it's really going to depend on intense dialogues with individual sectors, I think.
Thank you, Mark. I know I put you on a tough spot, but I think it was also important to at least have this on the back of our minds. I think we can now give the opportunity to the audience. I'm reading, I think, in my humble opinion, a really, really interesting question, and since it's going hand with the title of the conference, and they ask you, they don't say for who of you, but any of you jump in. Will these green industry policies in deep pocket countries hamper the opportunities of poorer countries, fragmented the world even more?
Maybe I can tackle that one. I think that there's a clear disadvantage for developing countries here, because basically the EU has money, the US has money, China has money, others somehow, and the developing countries are basically struggling to convince the multilateral development banks to put the finance on the table. And this is a work in progress. I think it's very important that the European and the American and the Japanese agree on some reform of the international financial institutions to have more financing power, and that will clearly be dedicated mainly for the green transition. That's clear, but the problem is that the money is not there yet. So yes, there's a risk here.
And also in combination, because I fully agree with that, but in combination with a more friendshoring policy, which is broader than what we are discussing today, of course, this risk, if it's pushed to its extreme, it really risks fragmentation. And WTO, World Bank, IMF, and lots of researchers have said that this could actually lead to a decrease of global GDP of between 5 and 7%, and even more in Africa. So there is a real danger here. We need to keep that in mind.
Thank you.
And the higher costs of everything, right, over the past couple of years have exacerbated social, political instability in a lot of developing countries, making them less appealing for investments. The one wrinkle in fragmentation that could actually prove positive for some developing countries is the fact that Chinese investors are facing barriers in investing into Europe and the US, so they're going to third countries. Mexico, Vietnam for access to the US, Morocco, or even sort of Eastern European countries for access into sort of the EU, or to blur the kind of Chinese origin, is actually potentially creating opportunities in third countries, and even places like sort of Indonesia, for instance, where there's a huge amount of nickel production, with countries, host countries wanting to capture more of the value add. They're actually developing processing in Indonesia is not necessarily good, it's not necessarily green unless there's an insistence on it being green. But the fragmentation and this need, I guess, to blur the origin of the country could, if used correctly and if channeled in a constructive way, could actually offset some of that risk.
Thank you, Michal. I'm reading a question for Nick. Would you say social reluctance for energy infrastructures is also conditioning investments? What can be done about it?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about permitting, this is an umbrella term that captures a lot of different things, and this is one of them. So when you're getting your environmental permit in particular, one of the key steps is you've got to do a public consultation. And this is absolutely necessary. It's clear that these investments affect people living or working in these areas. But the fact that they can be challenged and taken to courts is adding a lot of hurdles. And we have a big trade here and a big issue that we have to solve. And I think on the one hand, the first thing we have to do is link to education, explaining to people why this is happening, why this is necessary, why these infrastructures are being built. This will become even more important in the future. We've had a lot of discussion in Brussels over the past few months about the electricity grid, where we have a 20th century electricity grid that is going to have to power now a 21st century electricity system. So that will require investments. So part of it is, speaking with the local communities, making them understand why we are doing this. And then you need, in cases where people are displaced or they have a big power line or a windmill or something near to their house, possibilities for compensation if they're losing value to the household or whatever. But it's a big collaborative effort. We need everyone pulling together in the same direction, from the business community, that would be ourselves, local communities, regulatory authorities, other stakeholders as well.
Thank you, Nick. And now we have a question for Mark. You mentioned that each technology industry is different, and they ask, the audience asked if the Commission, well, you mentioned the Commission launched the European Wind Power Action Plan, and they want to know if the European Commission is planning to do this with other technologies.
Sorry, what did we launch?
The Wind Power Action Plan, the strategy you...
Yeah. Right, in the sense that focuses very much on clean tech and not on, let's say, steel or petrochemicals. So, yeah, here I'm afraid I have to repeat what I already said. I think what the President announced is that we're going to have these transition dialogues. We had one on hydrogen, there's one on the energy-intensive industries. So I think we don't have an immediate plan to launch a similar initiative for other things now, but it is something that's very high on the priority in terms of how can we act on that, like we see it also in the Net Zero Industry Act, where there is a request to include a lot of other different industries who feel that they have not been included and they should be, to be included there. And I think we need to see a bit what the response will be of the co-legislators to that request. But let's say no matter what the answer is, it's not going to be the final solution or the final answer in any way. So I think that, looking a bit ahead in the future and speculating a bit about what my job will be in, let's say, a year from now, I think that's going to be that's going to be one of the priorities. How do we address, in particular, I think, the energy-intensive industries in their transition to becoming green, because I think there we have, let's say, we have said different things, but it's not sufficient an answer yet.
Thank you, Mark. So we have reached the end of the debate, and I was going to kindly ask you for a brief takeaway in 30 seconds to try to resume a key message you think or you want to convey to the audience. I know it's a difficult task, but let's try, or 2 words, whatever you think, a key message you want to impact the audience. So if you want to start,
okay,
yeah, sorry.
I set the tone. Well, there's so much to discuss, but I would say that these are times when more than ever we need international cooperation and multilateral organs or institutions for the climate transition, but also for a lot of other things, health and inequalities and so on. Yet we are facing more fragmentation, more conflict, wars and geopolitical tensions than ever. So I hope that the world could sort of overcome this. I know it won't be easy, I'm not naive about this, but to sit together and see, because we've done it in the past, to see, can we create forums where we actually work together to solve the most pressing crisis, which is the climate crisis. And I know that there's a lot of competence here in this room, so I hope, also echoing what Ted said before, Tom, sorry, that we really need to take to see all of us what we can do to contribute to that.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Well, I completely agree with Cecilia, and I would add, from a European perspective, this challenges both the climate transition and the geopolitical situation in the neighborhood are really moments in which Europe can get together and push for deeper integration. And that goes for the reform of European Monetary Union, the internal market, etc. So it's really, when we look at history, it's in these kind of moments when Europe decides to take a step forward. And so this is something that we cannot miss this time.
I'm going to be slightly less ambitious and say that in this moment, I think we need more than ever informed, rational discussions. What we do today tends to be very polar, right? You're good, you're bad. You're fossil fuels, you're green. You are China, you're not China. We need, first of all, to understand the stakes. I think we don't take enough time to think through, to integrate, to talk to different stakeholders and communities. So let's talk, discuss, understand, and try and have rational and informed discussions.
Thank you. Mark?
Right. I mean, there are many things we can say about this. I'm going to take one tiny thing, preach a bit for my own church, as you would say in Dutch. I'm not sure if that's an English expression, actually. But what I think is needed and what I hope we will realize as we have European elections, for example, or national elections in some countries, is that to do all these things, we need administrations that are up to the task. If we talk about faster permitting, it doesn't mean less people that work on permitting because we want them to process faster. It actually means more people that work on permitting so that we can process them faster, thoroughly. So it's not necessarily at EU level, although I think also, but definitely at national and at local level, a capacity to guide and make this transition happen that we all want to make happen. That's going to be a real challenge, and I think we need to invest in that.
Thank you, Mark. And Nick?
Before, I think it was an advantage speaking last. Now it's tricky because you've used a lot of good points already. So I'll go down a different route. This is a transition that is going to affect the whole society. We need to make sure that everyone is moving forwards together. We have, I think, a lot of good focus already on the supply side, getting these new renewables, batteries, all of this into the system. We need to make sure we're looking at the demand side as well, making sure that we've spoken a bit about big industrial companies, making sure they can decarbonize, access renewable energy. But we need to look as well at the smallest consumers as well, households. But even if you think about a local corner shop, they need to have access to all of these things as well. So more collaboration. This is a societal level challenge, moving forwards together.
So thank you all of you. I personally learned a lot. I hope the audience as well, and it's been a pleasure to share the stage with all of you. So thank you all.
Hello again. It's now the time for the last session of this event. As has been traditional during the last years of this event, the focus is going to be the climate change international negotiations. Lara Lázaro Touza is the moderator. So I would like to invite her and also Ana Rivero Fernandez, operating partner ESG in Alantra Private Equity, to come to the stage. Our second speaker today in this session is Manuel Guerin, fellow at the European Climate Foundation. Is connecting to the session from Brazil. I must apologize because we are a little bit late and Emmanuel has been waiting. And I hope he is at the screen now. Hello, Emmanuel. Thank you. Welcome to the to the event. From my side, I would like to introduce you very briefly Lara. I'm sure you know her very well, so I will be very short. Lara Lázaro is Senior Analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute and teacher in Economic Theory at Cardenal Cisneros University College in Madrid. She holds a PhD from the London School of Economic and Political Science, a Master in Environmental Assessment and Evaluation from the same LSE, and a Bachelor degree in Economics from the Universidad Autónoma. When you are ready, please, Lara, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to moderate this conversation on COP28 and the road ahead. And for that, I have two distinguished panelists, Emmanuel Guérin, who's connecting online from Brazil. So thank you very much for coming online at this very early hour for you. Emmanuel, he's Special Advisor to Professor Laurence Tubiana at the European Climate Foundation. He's also a lecturer at Sciences Po University in Paris. Before that, he was the Executive Director in charge of International Affairs at the European Climate Foundation. He also is one of the architects of the Paris Agreement as in his roles as a Special Advisor to Laurence Tubiana and to Laurent Fabius from 2013 to 2015. He's Associate Director with Jeffrey Sachs of Sustainable Development Solution Network and Senior Staff Associate at the Earth Institute in Columbia University and Director for the Climate and Energy Program at EDRI from 2006 to 2012. And Ana Rivero Fernandez, she is the Operating Partner, ESG, at Alantra Private Equity. Prior to that, Ana has more than 30 years experience in Banco Santander, holding different positions as Global Head of ESG at Santander Asset Management, and she is currently a member of the Investment Committee at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation and is Professor of ESG at different universities and business schools here in Spain. So the topic of the main agenda items at COP28 include various topics. Concluding the global stocktake, we know that we have a 20-odd gigaton gap to fill, and that has been made apparent not only in the latest IPCC report, but also in the global stocktake report. We need to conclude that at COP28, and we need to chart a path to plug that gap. We know that the mitigation, and the European Union has welcomed the mitigation work program focused on just transition. We are also going to strive for global adaptation goal, and we have the pending issue of climate finance. We are hoping to bridge the gap for the 100 billion in international climate finance that we pledged back in COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. That was supposed to be reached annually by 2020. In COP26 in Glasgow, we set a path to close that gap, and we're hoping that will happen this year. However, we know we have to set a new goal, a new collective quantified goal next year, so we need to advance on negotiations for that. And we also need to align our financial flows with a low carbon transition and a resilient development model. In order to speak about all of these issues, I will start with Emmanuel. And Emmanuel, please, I would like to ask you we know that the tasks ahead, what can we expect from COP28 given the current fragmentation and the very complex geopolitical situation?
Yes, thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me well in the audience. And thank you very much for the invitation. Really sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's been really interesting to listen to the previous panel. In response to your question, what can we expect at COP28 and to prioritize a bit the different issues you've alluded to. Let me focus to start with on the issues that relate to the energy transition and the role of fossil fuels and phasing out of them into this transition, because obviously, given where the COP is happening in Dubai, this is inevitably the issue that is front and center in the political conversations, at least, and that relates very directly with the issues that were discussed in the previous panel in relation to the European industry and trade policies, I would say. It's not always easy, I must say, these days in the context of the fragmentation that previous speakers have mentioned, to be clear about the different initiatives or places in the negotiation where that conversation on the objective and the means of the energy transition is taking place at COP28. But precisely, it's at least those two different places. It's the political initiatives, if you will, expressed in texts of declaration that don't necessarily have a legal standing or in fact, in many cases, neither do they have follow through, which is an issue I'll come back to at the end here. But the initiatives that are being discussed at the moment relate to the objective of the tripling of the renewables energy installed capacity by 2030 globally. Another global objective, the doubling our energy efficiency again globally and by the same date. A third initiative to phase out now, hopefully very quickly, methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, because it's a promise that's been made a very long time ago now. So it really needs to happen as soon as possible. In addition to all of those specific initiatives, there is also a place that will be negotiated through a COP decision, and that's what relates to the overall objective of the energy transition itself, and whether we express it as a phasing out or down of fossil fuels or fossil fuel emissions. I mean, that's basically the four different options in the negotiation at the moment. I'll just say, to be brief, that the negotiation of the European Council conclusions just a few days ago probably give a bit of a preview of what will be the global conversation in a few weeks from now in Dubai. Some of you may know the very helpful role that Minister Teresa Ribera played for Spain and the rest of Europe, and the role of the presidency, very much with the support from the Commission and others in Europe. I'll not name all of them, but you also know that it was a tough and in part lost debate with Hungary and Poland in particular, in relation to the clarity that it'd be very useful to have that the ultimate objective is phasing out fossil fuels and not just fossil fuel emissions, even if there are indeed very important sometimes additions to make to that statement, in particular when it comes to the role of carbon capture and storage. I thought what the Commission and Spain and others tried to do to insist on the specificity of that use sector by sector, and also to give an idea of proportions in between the small part of the solution that CCS may turn out to be versus what needs to be the overall signal in the energy transition. That relates to my final point here before leaving the others for the second part of the conversation on the follow-ups from that. But I think there is one clear ratio, if you will, that we should all be looking at when we try to assess the outcome of COP28 when it comes to the energy transition, both by states, by companies, and by investors, and that's the ratio of investments in fossil fuels plus CCS indeed versus investments in renewable energies, but also more generally energy efficiency and electrification of energy and uses. That to me will be a very good way to discriminate in between the many initiatives that will be presented at COP28 and the ones that really matter. I think it's going to be important as well, and I'll stop there, for Europe to find a different way of talking to partners, in particular in the Global South, on the occasion of COP28, because indeed spending a lot of my time in Brazil at the moment, also just coming back from Congo for the Three Basins Summit, it's not always obvious to me, unfortunately, as a European, that Europe finds the way for the type of conversations you alluded to at the end of the last panels on striking partnerships with countries from the Global South on critical minerals, in addition to local green industrialized partnerships in those countries. But that's a different point, so I'll stop there to start with.
Thank you very much. So now onto the lever that makes all of this possible. And can you tell us what can we expect at COP28 on international climate finance, but also on private finance?
Yeah. Well, the issue with climate financing is that we are all referring always to that famous or infamous $100 billion that never get to arrive. But we have to remind that this was set at 2009. That is the aftermath of one of the biggest financial crises that we had. And it was thought, the mechanism and the final delivery of how the outcomes should be, that was thought, I believe, mainly for public finance, and not taking into account really to what extent private finance will be needed. We all knew that it is needed now more than ever, but what I think is that negotiations should, and maybe will, include this time different designs, different mechanisms, and not only being based, or mainly being based in figures, final figures, and final dates, and multi-year dates. This is intentional, of course, but what I think that can change things is the implication of the private sector, private finance sector. This is something that we have all seen happening, mainly not only in the financing part of the equation, but mostly in the investment part of the equation, where we have seen that regulations have changed and have been accelerating to bring sustainability, but moreover the E of the ESG, the environmental part of the investment, into place. and making people aware that this is something that we all need. It's not something that can be delayed anymore. It is true that, regulations come from the public part of the society or the agents, and regulations imply all society. But in those such big pledges, we sometimes forget how to make those decisions capillary and that they are understood by every agent in the economy. And I think that this is something that lacks the interest of the citizens. Not by itself, because if you ask any of the people that you can find wherever you go, they will all tell you that they are worried by climate change problems, and they, of course, would like that the financial sector would finance, private financial sector would finance a lot more than it's done, all these transition economies, etc. But when you come to the very first stages of the investment decisions or the financing decisions, this is really not something that you feel that is going to bring you some return, at least not in the short term. And this is one of the main problems that we have been suffering in the last 2 years. And in the last 2 years, of course, the war in Ukraine, but also the inflationary problems and the rising interest rates are, again, the first thing that you look in when you are into financial sector budgeting plans, or even if you are a private investor. We are always told, and it is true, that tackling climate change is urgent, but the problem is with the word urgent is that sometimes, like it has happened in 2020 with the pandemic, or in 2022 with the war, there are some more urgent short-term urgencies that just redefine your priorities in that very same year. Since 2019, 4 years have been, we have been through different urgencies that have required a different allocation of money than what you were thinking on a very long-term plan, such as the 15 years plan for countries for financing climate finance. For example, it is estimated that this year, last year, there was the same amount, I believe, $100 billion US allocated to the war in Ukraine and the different pledges that resulted from that. That was urgent and that was not planned. So this is something that we have to understand when you try to understand why. It's not the only reason, of course, but why financing has fell short. Because really the short time is something, the short time period planning is something that was not that urgent or that important 10 years ago, but 5 years ago or 3 years ago, it has become the main source of planification, the short-time problems that we have. Rising interest rates, of course, makes everything different from what the status of the imbalance that you had back in 2009, which we have been enjoying a decade of low to non-interest rates, and the world has changed completely. So it's a fragmented world, but it's also a very different world than a decade ago we had. So, of course, we need it's going to be a new plan, a new financing plan, because this one is over in 2025, so you need another one. But I think that the main difference here is going to be, or should be, in the design of it and the implication, the different implication of the private sector, because right now it's almost everything, every alliance that we have seen and every initiative that counts is voluntary, or it's something that has been pledged by some very important actors in the financial sector. But for example, GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is only 2 years and a half old. No? So it's a new paradigm in the financial sector, with new challenges mainly coming from financial factors such as interest rates and economic factors such as inflation. So we cannot let that these short-term urgencies will prevent us from designing a new commitment, financial commitment that includes private sector somehow in a different role than it had until now.
Thank you. And now thinking ahead, we've talked about how we need to think about international climate negotiations in moving forward. Talking to different actors, we see a contraction and convergence narrative by which these actors say, well, we are backsliding or we are delaying our ambitions and we are converging in that discourse versus science. And Michael was talking about having informed and data-driven analyses. So we have science on the other side saying we need to scale up, accelerate immensely, and we need to adhere to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So there's a clash, and I want to ask both of you how future climate negotiations can play out and how we can make them work more and faster. Emmanuel.
Yes, thank you very much for that very good question, and it's easy for me to build on what was just said. I think, by the way, what connects the two parts of the conversation is the outcome of COP28 on the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. And well, in addition to what I said earlier, in relation to the energy transition, in addition to the funding for the newly established loss and damage fund and a few other things, this is the other very important thing to watch at COP28, because this is what starts paving the road that will go from COP28 in Dubai to COP30 in Belém in Brazil in 2025 for the 10 years already of the Paris Agreement. And I think what we're going to have to do in those 2 years is not just implement the Paris Agreement or implement the policies and measures and targets climate-wise that have been taken in Europe and other parts of the world. Because if we only do that, and as important as implementation is as a theme, the gaps when it comes to mitigation and adaptation and the finance and investment for it are so big that it's at least a matter of acceleration and not just implementation that's at stake. I'll just say, because indeed the issue is very dear to my heart at a personal level, that there are also probably some evolutions in the Paris Agreement or in the global governance for climate action that are very much necessary. And I'll mention one in particular because I think it was already a theme of the previous panel and of our two interventions on this one. There needs to be something that manages the risk of fragmentation of everything, but also of this global climate negotiation. There are too many initiatives in all sorts of directions. They've got a bit on steroids, if you want my opinion, since Glasgow for COP26. A lot of them, frankly, and we've done the analysis, commissioned the reports, are not following through on their promises and intended actions. And this is where I think people are looking at the need to reprioritize the initiatives space, so everything that is under the umbrella of the UN high-level climate champions, reprioritize around a few key themes or deliverables. The negotiation itself, as I said, I think it needs to be on the acceleration of the climate action pre-2030 as much as it needs to be about setting new objectives. But there is a great amount of new objectives fatigue at this moment, at least in the context of global symmetry. So I think what's even more important is, in a way, what Europe is doing at the moment at home, which is to face the consequences of the huge investment walls we've got in front of us when it comes to the different aspects of the transition, both on the mitigation side of things and on the adaptation side of things, and find the ways through debt or new fiscal resources. At the end of the day, it can't be many other things, if not at least one of those two, to pay for the transition in a way that is fair when it comes to both income generation and the targets of those investments. What strikes me, and I'll yes.
Sorry, I need to cut you short there. If we have time, I'll come back to you. But Anna, if I may, so what are the key levers to make the transition happen from a financial and investment point of view in moving forward? And how can citizens appropriate that? And how can we engage them? Because I know we discussed, you know, in previous talks that, you know, that's probably one of the missing links.
Absolutely, and it's my personal belief, and I've always been an advocate to that. We are missing the link with the private, I was going to say sector, finance sector, but not. It's really the customers. It's really the citizens, the voters. I mean, you, me, the people that really are not, or they don't feel part of these decisions. And I can tell you from experience. I mean, I've been working in asset management for a lot of years or decades. And I know that in the last 15 years, it all has, and more in the last decade, it all has shifted to sustainability and to introducing ESG everywhere. But even if you are a fund manager or a fund investor, you are institutionally talking. You are a fund or you are an asset owner, and you make decisions that are linked with the decisions that are made on the corporate part of the business where you work. But then you have to ask for the money of retail investors, and they have to understand why we are asking for that money. Right now, it is not only in Spain, it's everywhere. Right now, people don't feel part of the discussion or part of the decision financially, I'm saying, because we have teach them how to recycle, maybe, and nobody asks anymore for a plastic bag when they go to a supermarket. But they don't do the same when they make financial decisions, because it's not in their agenda. All those things are not in the agenda for normal people walking in the streets. So they have to believe or to trust in what the salespeople in the financial institution are telling them. And sometimes those big forces, which are the commercial people in the financial institutions, are not that, they don't feel that implied also. So they feel like, what do I have to say? What the corporate message is, so I say the corporate message, but I don't feel like I'm having any say on that. And it is really a powerful force. And I always put the same example of the plastic bags, because really it's so clear. I mean, nobody is forcing any supermarket to have plastic bags, because you have understood that this is not good, it's bad. And they have alternatives. And those alternatives are maybe a bit costly, because they charge you for those new type of bags, but everyone has assumed that for a greater good, because you feel part of it. The common goods that Jose Juan was talking about, no? The common goods are understood. It doesn't happen the same in the financial part, which is really important. Without financing all the transition and investing in the transition, we are not going to deliver. So we need to integrate and to incorporate the thinking of the common normal people, which are also the owners of the common goods, so they understand what is missing in their investment or financing decisions. And I feel that right now this is not in the agenda. And if this is so, and then we can argue that demand is a powerful force, that will make also all the financial sector even more eager to change the design of the products, the financing structures that they have, into what people is really keen on improving. And it's a question of everybody here. It's a task for everyone. It's not. I sometimes feel that we are always expecting that someone tells us this is what you have to invest in. Someone tells us this is what you have to consume. This is what. So it's really not that embedded into the process and into the mindset of a financial decision. And I really, really believe that this is such a powerful force that we are missing in all these different ways of finding how to finance.
Thank you. I don't think we have time for more, so I'll just wrap it very quickly up. It's been a very interesting discussion. We've gone through what we can expect from COP28, including that commitment to triple renewables, to double energy efficiency that the European Commission, along with the COP President Al Jaber, have been talking about for a long time, and alongside other actors. We also expect advances in international climate finance, and I will just underline a couple of issues in moving forward. So implementation. We need to stick to what science is telling us and to the facts within a narrative as well. I think that's also come out a few times during our talk today. Delivering and changing our priorities and accelerating, and obviously looking at not only the supply side of the market, but also the demand side of the market. Thank you ever so much. It's been my pleasure and honor, and we hope to see you next year as well.
Gracias a Lara, Ana, Emmanuel. Y llegamos a la recta final del evento, retomo el español, que hemos querido finalizar un año más con un vídeo breve con declaraciones de los miembros de las empresas miembros del Comité Español del Consejo Mundial de la Energía. Van acompañadas además de un breve vídeo al final que es promocional del Congreso Mundial de la Energía, que el año que viene, en abril, tendrá lugar en la ciudad de Rotterdam, entre los días 22 y 25 de abril exactamente, y bueno, va a ser, yo creo, el evento más importante del sector energético a nivel internacional del año que viene, y esperamos que, está aquí cerquita en Europa, os invitamos a que participéis y nada más por mi parte. Si el vídeo está preparado, pues por favor, gracias.
La industria europea afronta actualmente un gran reto en diferentes frentes, en particular en lo que se refiere a la incorporación de tecnologías verdes para conseguir formas de producción más sostenibles. Más allá de su aportación al crecimiento económico y a la creación de empleo, la industria juega un papel esencial en la evolución de la sociedad moderna como aportadora de prosperidad y demandante de mayor y mejor cualificación profesional, como introductora de innovación y aportadora de métodos productivos respetuosos con el planeta. A pesar de ello, resulta cada vez más imprescindible que los gobiernos aseguren un entorno regulatorio estable que permita a la industria avanzar con sus inversiones y alcanzar sus objetivos. EDP, como proveedor global de energía, contribuye a estos retos liderando la transición energética. Año tras año, EDP expande su capacidad instalada de energías renovables, invierte en redes eléctricas y digitalización y promueve de forma activa nuevos productos, servicios y tecnologías de utilidad para sus clientes, con proyectos tan prometedores como el hidrógeno verde, el almacenamiento de energía y la conversión y hibridación de instalaciones ya existentes.
En estos momentos es evidente que la transición energética es una necesidad y una oportunidad para acelerar los objetivos de descarbonización y lograr una mayor autonomía estratégica para Europa. El panorama geopolítico no es sencillo, pero debemos ser más ambiciosos que nunca. Y la Unión Europea puede y debe liderar ese camino hacia un nuevo paradigma energético en el que las moléculas verdes como el hidrógeno verde o los biocombustibles nos permitan alcanzar los objetivos climáticos. Como hemos visto en esta jornada del CECME que acaba de concluir, la COP28 nos permitirá avanzar sin duda en esta dirección, porque el futuro no es un lugar lejano al que vamos, es la nueva realidad palpable que ya estamos construyendo entre todos. Y en Cepsa queremos ser un protagonista destacado de este futuro.
El futuro del clima y la energía van de la mano, para lo cual hay que desarrollar e implementar a nivel global las políticas que fomenten el desarrollo y expansión de las energías renovables, incluyendo, obviamente, los gases renovables, entre ellos el hidrógeno. España puede y debe hacer su aportación a ese desarrollo. Seguridad de suministro e integración de mercados siguen siendo esenciales en ese nuevo paradigma y la contribución de la infraestructura básica para su consecución.
La reciente crisis energética y económica ha dado un vuelco al contexto energético y geopolítico, pero la emergencia climática no permite un retraso en la transición energética. La transición energética tiene que continuar avanzando, debe intensificarse mediante políticas y una regulación que permita un despliegue masivo de energías renovables, una electrificación de la demanda y una descarbonización de la industria y de la economía.
La transición energética es en realidad una transición de nuestro modelo económico hoy basado en combustibles fósiles a otro basado en energías renovables. Esta transición representa una auténtica revolución industrial que traerá cambios y numerosas oportunidades. Apostar por la economía verde es en realidad hacer política industrial que nos permitirá mantener nuestra actividad actual y atraer nuevas actividades industriales, creando empleos cualificados y de futuro.
En Naturgy creemos que el biometano como gas renovable es la solución perfecta para el trilema energético. Reduce la dependencia energética, estabiliza los precios y además es neutro en carbono y respetuoso con el medio ambiente mediante la solución de economía circular.
Buenos días. Muy acertado poner el foco en la industria europea, por cierto, la más eficiente medioambientalmente del mundo, pero un sector en el que venimos perdiendo peso en la economía europea de forma sistemática, incumpliendo nuestros objetivos de reindustrialización. Y además, eso suele ser debido al movimiento, al desplazamiento de esa misma industria hacia regiones con una regulación más laxa. Y luego venimos e importamos esos mismos productos, añadiendo a la huella de carbono pues toneladas que se hubieran evitado si las produjéramos en Europa, con lo cual además perjudicamos la lucha contra el cambio climático. La industria ayuda a la resiliencia en la parte de baja del ciclo, paga mejores salarios, más estables puestos de trabajo, invierte mucho más en tecnología e I+D+I. Por tanto, debemos repensar la política industrial europea y tenemos un buen modelo. El modelo que han implantado los Estados Unidos de América con su ley de reducción de la inflación se basa en una neutralidad, en promover, en incentivar en la zanahoria esas energías e industrias menos contaminantes y no simplemente por sesgos ideológicos la selección de determinadas tecnologías ganadoras o prohibir aquellas que no nos gustan en vez de dejarlas desarrollarse. Por tanto, creo que es un gran acierto elegir este tema.
Hoy nadie duda de que el futuro de la energía está profundamente ligado al proceso de transición energética. Desde el sector gasista estamos comprometidos en liderar la transformación de nuestro modelo energético y facilitar así el logro de los objetivos Net Zero en 2050. En este contexto, los gases renovables, el biometano y el hidrógeno renovable serán vectores clave para afrontar los desafíos climáticos y garantizar un sistema energético asequible, sostenible y seguro para todos.
En línea con lo que se ha comentado a lo largo del día de hoy, deciros que Total Energies está totalmente comprometida con el proceso de transición energética y estamos apuntando a estar en el año 2050 entre las 5 empresas del mundo energéticas con mayor potencia renovable instalada y además ser neutros en carbono en el año 2050.
The world is radically changing, but the challenge remains: the transition towards clean and inclusive energy. Do you want to be part of the future of energy? The 26th World Energy Congress is the most influential global energy event of our time. This long-standing energy gathering connects a dynamic community of international leaders to take action. Join us in Rotterdam in 2024.
Pues damos por finalizado el evento. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos y esperamos veros el año que viene. Muchas gracias.